The darkness before dawn in Juniper Draw had a weight to it, a physical presence that settled in the lungs and chilled the bone. It was a cold that wasn't just about the absence of sun. It was the cold of iron-rich earth and high desert air, sharp and clean and utterly unforgiving. This was the hour Nora Vale had chosen, an hour that belonged to no one, a crack in time between the ghost of yesterday and the threat of tomorrow. Her movements were whispers of motion in the deep gloom of the barn's tack room, which had been her cramped home for 2 weeks. The canvas satchel, worn smooth by desperation and long roads, was nearly full. There wasn't much to pack a spare wool shirt, a small tin of salve for her hands, a half loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and the tattered photograph she never looked at but couldn't leave behind. Her fingers, though raw and chapped from lye soap and splintered wood, worked with a practiced economy, folding the shirt into a tight square, tucking it beside the bread. Each motion was deliberate, silent, a prayer against the creak of a floorboard or the rustle of a curious mouse. She was a ghost preparing for her own vanishing. She had to leave. The whispers had started as a low hum in the Dry Lantern Ridge saloon, but they had followed her here to Larkspur Ranch, carried on the wind like bitter seeds. They had taken root in the sideways glances of the other hands, in the too polite silence that fell when she entered the cookhouse. That Vale widow. The words coiled around her name, branding her with a past that wasn't entirely her own. They said her husband hadn't died in a simple railroad accident. They said he'd died a thief, and that she, his quiet shadow, knew more than she let on. They said she was a lure, a bad luck charm, a woman who brought trouble as surely as a storm brings rain. The final knot on the satchel's drawstring pulled tight. Nora slung it over her shoulder, the meager weight a familiar burden. She paused, her breath held tight in her chest, and listened. The only sounds were the deep, rhythmic breathing of the horses in their stalls, the soft sigh of the wind nudging the barn eaves, and the frantic, bird-like thumping of her own heart. She had to be gone before the first hint of gray softened the eastern horizon, before the ranch stirred to life. She had taken wages from Graham Lark, but she would leave the silver coins she'd earned on the nailhead by the door. She would take nothing that wasn't hers. She would leave as she had arrived with next to nothing, indebted to no one. Stepping out of the tack room and into the main aisle of the barn was like entering a vast, sleeping cathedral. The air, thick with the scent of animal warmth, was layered with the smells of damp straw, sweet molasses-laced feed, and the cold, mineral tang of well-worn leather. The familiar aromas had been a comfort for the past 14 days, a simple reality to cling to amidst the storm of rumor. Now, they felt like an accusation. The great barn door, her gateway to a precarious freedom, stood as a dark rectangle against the slightly less dark night. She moved down the aisle, her worn boots making no sound on the packed earth floor, past the stall of Thistle, the mare with a coat like spun moonlight, who nickered softly as she passed, past the stall of the big roan gelding who watched her with one intelligent, liquid eye. She allowed herself a fleeting touch on the smooth wood of the stall door, a silent goodbye. These animals, with their simple needs and honest natures, had been her only true companions. The heavy crossbar of the main door was cool and solid beneath her palms. She lifted it with excruciating slowness, her muscles straining to prevent a single groan from the wood. It came free. She eased the door open just enough to slip through, a sliver of the cold, star-dusted night beckoning. The air that rushed in was sharp, carrying the alkaline bite of the distant salt flats, a scent of ancient, dry decay. One step. She was outside. The cold bit at her cheeks, and she pulled the threadbare wool collar of her coat tighter. The damp, earthy smells of the barn clung to her, a scent of a life she was already leaving behind. She took another step, her boot crunching softly on the gravelly dirt. Then, a presence. She didn't hear it so much as feel it, a shift in the air, a stillness that was not empty. Her entire body went rigid. Before she could turn, before she could even draw a proper breath to run, a hand closed around her wrist, It was not a brutal grip. It was firm, unyielding, but possessed a warmth that was a startling shock against her chilled skin. It was a large hand, the palm and fingers layered with the hard-won calluses of a man who worked with rope and wood and the unforgiving land. She knew the feel of that hand, had felt it once before when he had helped her down from the supply wagon upon her arrival. Graham Lark. Wait. His voice was a low rumble, barely louder than the wind, yet it cut through the silence with absolute authority. He stood so close behind her that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the pre-dawn chill. Tell me why. A tremor of pure, animal panic shot through Nora. She jerked her arm. A futile, desperate attempt to break free. Mr. Lark, she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. The carefully constructed wall of her composure crumbled into dust. Tears she had fiercely suppressed now burned hot behind her eyes. Please, just let me go. I have to be away from here before the sun is up. Why? He asked again, his grip not tightening, but not yielding either. He moved slightly, coming to stand beside her, though he kept his face in the deep shadows. I won't be a debt here, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I won't bring my trouble to your door. The tears finally broke free, tracing cold paths down her cheeks. She turned her face away, ashamed of the weakness, furious at her own inability to simply disappear without a trace. The wind picked up, a mournful sigh that swept across the vast, sleeping expanse of the ranch. It stirred the dust from the alkali flats to the west, a fine, ghostly powder that tasted of salt and regret. From a nearby corral, a magnificent buckskin stallion tossed its head, its dark mane a slash of defiance against the gloom, and let out a sharp snort as if in protest of the entire clandestine scene. Graham's gaze was fixed on her, and in the faint starlight, his eyes seemed to absorb the darkness rather than reflect it. His focus wasn't on her tear-streaked face, but on a detail just below her jawline. He shifted his stance, bringing him more into the faint light filtering from the barn. That mark, he said, his voice softer now, losing its hard edge. Under the strap of your bonnet. Nora's free hand flew to her cheek instinctively. She knew what he was seeing, a raw, reddish abrasion, a chafe that had deepened to a dull, bruised purple at the edges. It was an ugly mark, the kind that fed rumors, the kind a man might leave on a woman. It's not what you think, she said quickly, her voice sharp with a sudden need to defend an honor she felt she'd already lost. I know what it is, he replied, and the quiet certainty in his voice silenced her. It's from hauling hay bales. From the twine on a 50-pound sack cutting into your shoulder all night, shifted from one side to the other until the strap of your bonnet was the only thing left to dig in. The accuracy of his observation stunned her. She had spent most of the night not sleeping in her small room, but in the hayloft, methodically moving and stacking the new bales delivered yesterday, working herself to the point of numb exhaustion. It was a penance, a way to physically exhaust the ghosts that haunted her mind, and he had seen the truth of it in a single glance. He had seen her labor, not her shame. He finally eased the pressure on her wrist, though his fingers remained, a warm circle of contact. In 3 days, we have the cattle count, he said, his tone shifting to one of grim practicality. The biggest of the year? Jed, my foreman, he found another 2 calves yesterday with their brands blotted. These brand thieves, they're getting bolder. If you leave now, I'll be another hand short. A good hand. They'll eat me alive. Nora, they'll pick this ranch clean. She hesitated, the raw plea for help in his voice warred with her instinct for self-preservation. She had come to Larkspur seeking nothing more than an honest, anonymous wage for mucking out stalls and brushing down horses. A place to be invisible. But from the moment she had arrived, she felt as if she had stepped from one maelstrom into another. Her past, tangled with the memory of her late husband, his desperate gamble, and the missing, half-signed contract for a railroad spur, had followed her. It was a shadow she couldn't outrun. The whispers in town had tied her name to that lost contract, insinuating she was here for a piece of land, a claim, something far more valuable than a stable hand's pay. As if summoned by her thoughts, A long, mournful sound drifted on the wind from miles away. The whistle of the early morning maintenance train, its lonely call echoing through the draws and across the flats. The sound was a physical blow, transporting her back to another town, another pre-dawn darkness filled with the screech of steel wheels and the shattering finality of loss. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement. Graham felt it. His grip on her wrist loosened completely, his hand falling away. He was giving her the choice, to run, as she had intended, or to stay. For a long, suspended moment, Nora did not move. Her wrist, where his hand had been, tingled with a phantom warmth. She didn't pull away. She stood frozen, caught in a strange, terrifying equilibrium. Part of her screamed to flee, to put miles of unforgiving terrain between herself and this place, this man and the ghosts he was unintentionally stirring. But another part, a small, weary, and desperately hopeful part, wanted to believe in the man who saw the truth in a bruise, who asked for help instead of casting judgment. A current, sharp and vital as a lightning strike, ran up her spine. It was a fusion of fear and a fragile, unfamiliar desire to trust. He saw the conflict in her rigid posture, in the way she stood poised on the knife's edge of decision. He took a half-step back, giving her space, but his voice, when he spoke again, was close and intensely personal. "If you have to leave," he said, the words a quiet promise in the vast darkness, "then leave with me, after the count. But not like this. Not alone in the dark." The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to every harsh reality she had ever known, that it stole the breath from her lungs. He wasn't just asking her to stay for his ranch. He was offering her his protection, his company on the road away from it, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Nora gave a single, shallow nod. It wasn't a promise to stay. It wasn't an agreement to anything beyond this single, suspended moment. It was a concession, a truce with the rising sun. But she took no further step toward the darkness. She remained where she was, the cold wind whipping a loose strand of hair across her face, her small satchel feeling impossibly heavy on her shoulder. She did not run, and in the pregnant silence between one heartbeat and the next, that was enough. 2 weeks earlier, the air had been thick with a different kind of chill. It was the oppressive, sun-baked heat of midday in Dry Lantern Ridge, a town that consisted of little more than a dusty main street, a sprawling saloon, a mercantile, and the stagecoach office. When Nora Vale stepped down from the Concord coach, she was the last passenger to disembark. She landed on the warped boardwalk with a soft thud of worn-out boots, and for a moment, she simply stood there, letting the wall of heat wash over her. The other passengers, a boisterous salesman and a stern-looking woman with 3 hat boxes, hurried toward the shade of the hotel porch. Nora remained in the glare, a solitary figure in a faded calico dress, her world reduced to the few items she possessed. She carried a single canvas satchel, the same one she had packed in the pre-dawn darkness 2 weeks later. In her dress pocket, her fingers nervously traced the outline of a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter of introduction. It was a promissory note, a debt owed to her late husband, signed by a man whose name was now synonymous with failure and disgrace. The paper was worthless as currency, but it was the only proof she had that her husband hadn't been a complete fool, or perhaps proof that he had. It was a map of her own ruin, and she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. She stood there, shrouded in a stubborn, almost defiant silence, until the station master, tired of her blocking the path, grunted, "You movin', ma'am, or takin' route?" Nora flinched and moved, her destination uncertain. She had heard there was work in this valley, that the ranches were hiring. She had walked from the stage office to the saloon, not to enter, but because it was the only other hub of activity. She was standing across the street, trying to muster the courage to ask the mercantile owner about ranch work, when Graham Lark rode into town. He was not a man who passed unnoticed, yet he seemed to move without seeking attention. He rode a tall bay gelding, and his focus was entirely on the sacks of grain he was securing to his pack mule. Nora watched him. She had seen men like him before, men who owned the land they stood on, who carried an aura of quiet, burdened authority. He looked tired. He looked strong. He looked like he didn't have time for nonsense. She crossed the street. Her shadow fell over him as he tied the last knot. "Mr." Her voice was rusty from disuse. Graham Lark looked up. He squinted against the sun, his gaze sharp and assessing. He saw a woman in her late 20s, pale beneath the dust of the road, with eyes that looked like they had seen too much and said too little. She was thin, but her hands, clasped in front of her, were not delicate. "Ma'am," he acknowledged, his voice polite but distant. "I'm looking for work. Anything. Cookin', cleanin', mendin'." She swallowed, forcing the next words out. "I can muck a stall. I'm strong." He held her gaze for a long moment. Dry Lantern Ridge was a hard place, and women who arrived alone on the stagecoach were usually running from something or toward something worse. "I don't need a house cook," he said flatly, "and my hands do their own mendin'." Her face fell, but she didn't plead. She simply nodded, a small, tired acceptance of the inevitable, and prepared to turn away. "But," he said, stopping her. He looked at her hands again. "My last stable hand quit 2 days ago. Said the work was too hard and the pay too little. He wasn't wrong on either count." He gestured with his chin toward the barn 3 at his ranch, miles away. Though she couldn't know that. The work is mucking stalls, brushing down a dozen horses, mixing feed, and keeping the tack clean. It's sunup to sundown. Pay is board and 20 a month. "Board?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A loft. In barn number 3, it's dry, and it's clean. Nothing else." "I'll take it," she said, without a second's hesitation. And so, she had arrived at Larkspur Ranch, not as a guest, but as a hired hand. Her status only slightly above that of the horses she was paid to tend. Graham had shown her the loft himself. It was reached by a steep, solid ladder. The space was large, tucked under the high-peaked roof, with a single, small window at one end that looked out over the western alkali flats. A simple rope-strung cot, a 3-legged stool, and a crate with a wash basin and pitcher were the only furnishings. But, as he had promised, it was clean. The air smelled of dry hay and old, sun-baked wood. "The cookhouse serves at 5 and at sundown," he'd said from the bottom of the ladder. "My foreman is Jed Cormack. He'll show you the feed measures in the morning." And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone in her new, sparse home. Nora worked with a silent, consuming fervor. She rose before the cookhouse bell, using the pre-dawn quiet to scrub the water troughs. She mucked the stalls with a rhythmic efficiency that saved her back. She learned the specific temperaments of each horse thistle. The nervous mare needed to be spoken to in a low monotone before she would accept the bridle. The big roan gelding liked his ears rubbed. Graham's own bay, Titan, would stand like a statue, watching her with an unsettling intelligence. Her silence was a fortress. The other hands, a rough collection of men who valued pragmatism over politeness, initially regarded her with suspicion. A woman in the barns was an anomaly. But after a few days, they mostly left her be. She did her work without complaint. She never asked for help. And she never, ever engaged in the idle, crude gossip that passed for conversation. She found a small patch of wild mint growing by the well house. She began crushing the dried leaves in her pocket. And soon, the barn aisles began to lose their sharp, ammoniac smell, replaced by a faint, clean fragrance. The horses, usually skittish and prone to kicking, grew calmer. They would nicker when they heard her step, turning their heads to follow her small, determined figure as she moved from stall to stall. This quiet, fragile peace was not destined to last. Trouble was already brewing on the edges of Larkspur. Jed Cormack, Graham's foreman, rode in late one afternoon, his face grim. He dismounted before his horse had even stopped, carrying a piece of stiff, dried hide. He found Graham by the branding furnace, checking the irons for the upcoming count. "Boss," Jed said, his voice low. He unfurled the hide. On it was the clear, sharp L of the Larkspur brand, but beside it, the edges of the wound were puckered and messy. the scar tissue deliberately blurred and overlaid with a crude, interlocking B. Found this on a calf, dead in a gully by Silver Butte. The rest of the small herd she was with, gone. It's them brand ghosts. Sir, they ain't just altering the mark. They're getting sloppy, or arrogant, or both. Graham stared at the ruined brand, his jaw tightening. This was the third incident in as many months. These brand ghosts were not simple rustlers. They were systematic, clever, and they were costing him a fortune. They're trying to push us, Graham said, his voice flat and hard. Trying to see how far they can go before we push back. They're pushing hard, Jed agreed. And with the big count just days away. Graham nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon, the vast, vulnerable expanse of his land. He had another problem, and he was acutely aware of it. The social heart of Juniper Draw, and thus, its rumor mill was the Gilded Cage, the saloon owned and operated by Mabel Crow. Mabel was a striking woman with hair the color of a new penny and a sharp business mind. She had built the Gilded Cage from a 2-room grog shop into the most profitable establishment in the county. She was also a woman who had, for a brief, intense year, believed she would be the next Mrs. Lark. Graham's polite but firm disinterest had been a slight she had never forgiven. He was a widower, a prime catch, and his polite rejection had felt like a public humiliation. When Nora Vale arrived, Mabel had taken immediate notice. She saw the way Graham had spoken to the woman in the street, the brief, business-like exchange that ended with the widow riding out toward his ranch on the supply wagon. That night, as she poured a measure of rye for a cowhand, Mabel let the first drop of poison fall. "A new hand out at Larkspur, I hear," the cowhand had said, making idle chat. Mabel finished the pour, her hand steady, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. A widow. From back east, they say." She slid the glass across the bar. "You be careful with widows. Silas, every widow has her own bag of tricks. Some are just better at hiding it." That was all it took. The seed was planted. It lay dormant for a week, watered by the natural suspicion of a small, isolated community. Then, the rumor of Nora's past, which had followed her on the stagecoach, finally caught up. A freight agent, passing through, recognized the name Vale in connection with a scandal that had been hushed up but not forgotten, the fight over the Black Willow Railroad spur. The original survey for the spur line, designed to connect the main track to the silver mines in the north, was supposed to bypass the Juniper Draw Valley entirely. But a new, revised contract had surfaced, one that would reroute the track, cutting directly through the fertile grazing land of several ranches. The most significant parcel it would cross, rendering a vital spring and the entire Meadowhook pasture useless, belonged to Graham Lark. Nora's late husband had been a low-level negotiator for the railroad, and his name had been linked to the disputed, and possibly fraudulent, revised contract. That night, the Gilded Cage was buzzing. Mabel Crow, in a dress of dark green satin, moved through the tables, her laughter bright and sharp. "It's a land grab, plain and simple," a rancher declared, slamming his fist on the table. "That railroad thinks it can just buy its way through our pastures." Mabel stopped, tilting a bottle of whiskey toward his glass. "Oh, it's not just the railroad, darling," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial purr. "They need eyes on the inside, someone to assess the value, find the weaknesses." She let the implication hang in the smoky air. "What are you saying, Mabel?" She smiled, straightening up. "I'm just saying, it's a mighty big coincidence. A man dies fighting for a piece of paper that could ruin this valley, and then his grieving widow shows up, quiet as a mouse, and plants herself right in the middle of the very land that paper would condemn." She moved to the bar, her voice rising just enough to carry, "Maybe that widow is just waiting to bite off her own piece of land by the tracks." The poison had found its mark. The next day, the whispers were everywhere. Graham heard them. He had ridden into town for supplies and had stood in the mercantile for 10 minutes, listening to the proprietor and another customer discuss the railroad widow at Larkspur. Graham paid for his salt and beans, his face an unreadable mask, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He said nothing. He didn't defend her. He didn't deny it. To do so would be to give the rumor more power, to show it had struck a nerve. But as he rode home, his gaze was sharper, his mind calculating. He watched the dusty trails leading to his branding fields, not just for the brand ghosts, but with a new, unwelcome suspicion. Was it possible the two threats were connected? Was this quiet, hard-working woman in his barn a part of a larger, more insidious plan to break him? Nora heard it all. She felt it in the way Jed Cormac's polite "mornin', ma'am" was now clipped and brief, his eyes not quite meeting hers. She saw it in the way the other hands would fall silent when she entered the cookhouse, only to resume their low muttering as soon as she left with her plate of food, which she always ate alone in the loft. She chose silence as her armor. She kept her head down, her back straight, and her hands busy. If she scrubbed the water troughs until her knuckles bled, it was her own business. If she groomed the horses until their coats shone like polished wood, it was only what she was paid for. But the armor had cracks. One afternoon, she was grooming Thistle, the nervous mare. The whispers from the bunkhouse, its window open to the yard, were clear. Lost it all. Came here to get it back. Lark's land. Nora's hand, holding the curry comb, began to tremble. It was a slight, betraying tremor, but Thistle felt it instantly. The mare's skin twitched, and she shifted, her ears pinning back in agitation. "Easy, girl," Nora whispered, her voice tight, but her hand wouldn't stop shaking. The injustice of it, the sheer, crushing weight of their assumptions, made her want to scream. Instead, she dropped the comb and pressed her forehead against the mare's warm, dusty neck, breathing in the simple, honest scent of the animal. Thistle, sensing the distress rather than the anger, quieted and nudged Nora's shoulder with her soft muzzle. Nora stayed there for a long time, her small, trembling body shielded by the horse. That night, a different, softer connection was forged. Graham's children, 6-year-old Ivy and 8-year-old Abel, were quiet, watchful children, still grieving their mother who had been taken by fever 2 years prior. They rarely came near the barns, preferring the familiar confines of the main house and its small, walled-in garden. But they had watched Nora. They saw her gentleness with the horses, the way she would leave small, bruised apples from the cook's discard pile on the fence posts for the foals. One morning, Nora came down the ladder from her loft to find a small tin bottle of milk resting on the bottom step. It was still cool from the spring house. She looked around, but the yard was empty, save for the fleeting glimpse of 2 small heads vanishing around the corner of the main house. A knot formed in her throat, so tight it ached. It was a simple, pure gesture. A child's kindness, offered without agenda or suspicion. A few nights later, a storm had blown in, and the drop in temperature had agitated Ivy, bringing on a cough that kept her, and the entire house, awake. Graham, weary and frustrated, was pacing the hallway, the child whimpering in his arms, when Nora, on her way to check on Thistle, who spooked in high winds, passed the main house. The door was ajar for the breeze, and Graham saw her pause in the yellow rectangle of light. He was too tired to care about appearances. "Can't get her to settle," he said, his voice raw with exhaustion. Nora hesitated, her hand on the barn lantern. She looked at the small, coughing child. Ivy's eyes, wide and feverish, met hers. Nora stepped just inside the doorway, setting her lantern on the floor. She didn't reach for the child. Instead, she knelt on the wooden floor and placed her hand flat on the boards. She began to tap. It was a soft, steady rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. A pause. Tap. Tap, 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 tap. It was the sound of a horse at a calm, steady walk on hard-packed earth. A hoof-tapping rhythm she used in the barn to soothe a spooked foal. A simple, mindless pattern that spoke of movement, of safety, of the world being in its proper order. Ivy's whimpers softened. her breathing hitching, her gaze fixed on Nora's hand, on the strange, gentle sound that was so unlike the wind howling outside. Tap, 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 tap. Nora didn't look up, her focus entirely on the rhythm, on the small, distressed child. Graham stood frozen, watching. He didn't understand what she was doing. It was the strangest, simplest, and most unexpectedly effective thing he had ever seen. The tension slowly drained from Ivy's small body. Her coughing subsided into a sleepy sniffle. Her eyelids grew heavy. Nora continued the rhythm for another full minute, until the child's breathing was deep and even, asleep in her father's arms. Slowly, Nora's hand stilled. She looked up at Graham. In the dim light of the hallway, their eyes met over the sleeping child. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The rumors in town painted her as a scheming, dangerous woman. But the man standing in the hallway saw only a quiet, profound kindness, a gentleness that had just calmed his daughter when he could not. A silent, invisible thread had been drawn between them in that moment. It was not love. It was not even friendship. It was something far more rare and fundamental, a recognition. He had seen her, the real her, if only for an instant. And it was this recognition, this seed of doubt against the town's poison, that would make him stop her in the darkness. Days later, with a hand on her wrist and a demand to know the truth, the fragile truce forged in the pre-dawn darkness held for 2 days, a period of charged silence and unspoken questions. The rhythm of the ranch continued, a relentless drumbeat of chores against which a more sinister tempo was beginning to build. The air itself felt different, thin and sharp, humming with an unseen tension. Graham Lark was a man coiled, his usual quiet watchfulness honed to a razor's edge. He missed nothing, a horse that shied at nothing, a fence post that seemed out of place, the way the wind carried sounds from the distant buttes. The blow came on the morning of the second day. Jed Cormack rode in from the north pasture, not at a gallop, but at a slow, funereal pace, leading a single, bewildered-looking calf. He didn't speak until Graham was at his side, his eyes already on the fresh, angry-looking brand on the animal's flank. It was a larkspur L, but it was ugly, laid on with a heavy, unskilled hand. "There's 11 more just like her, scattered in the arroyo," Jed said, his voice a low growl of disgust. "They must have cut them from their mothers in the night. The cows are half wild, calling for them." Graham ran his calloused hand over the forged brand. It was more than just a crude copy. It was an insult. "They're getting sloppy," he said, echoing Jed's earlier sentiment. "This is just pure arrogance." "It's worse than that, boss," Jed said grimly. He pointed to the calf's belly, just below the rib cage. A thin, dark line, scabbed over and dry, ran about 6 inches long. It was a shallow cut, almost surgical in its precision. "Look here. This is their real signature." Graham knelt, his brow furrowed. "What am I looking at?" "It's a dry cut," Jed explained, his voice steeped in the grim knowledge of his trade. "They make a shallow slice on the belly, long before they rebrand. It draws the blood away from the surface of the hide. See, when the real brand heals, the scar tissue is thinner, paler. Then, when they come back and blot it with their own iron, the new burn takes deeper, hides the old lines better. It's clever, and it's vicious. These ain't ordinary thieves." Graham stood up, a cold fury settling in his gut. This was calculated, professional work. The brand ghosts were not just stealing from him. They were systematically dismantling his legacy, one calf at a time, using methods that were as cruel as they were effective. He looked out toward the vast, rolling hills of his ranch, and for the first time, he felt a chilling sense of being besieged, outmaneuvered by a faceless enemy who knew his land and his animals as well as he did. The second blow landed that afternoon. It was delivered not by a rustler's iron, but on a folded piece of cheap paper. One of the younger ranch hands found it tucked into the cinch of Graham's saddle, which had been left on the corral fence. The note was anonymous. The letters formed in a crude, blocky script with charcoal. The message was short and devoid of subtlety. "Lark, keep the Vale Widow and you lose the Juniper Creek. We are watching." Graham read the words twice, his knuckles white where he gripped the paper. The Juniper was more than a creek. It was the main artery of his ranch, the source of the water rights that kept his herds alive through the brutal, dry summers. To lose it would be to lose everything. The threat was not just aimed at his livelihood, but at his very survival, and it placed Nora Vale squarely at the center of the storm. The whispers in town had been poison. This was a blade pressed to his throat. He didn't show the note to Jed. He folded it, tucked it deep into his shirt pocket, and went looking for Nora. He found her in the tack room, methodically rubbing saddle soap into a worn set of reins. The small space was filled with the clean, sharp scent of leather and mint. She looked up as his shadow fell across the doorway, her eyes immediately wary. Without a word, he unfolded the note and handed it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. Her eyes scanned the crude letters, and all the color drained from her face, leaving her skin as pale and translucent as fine porcelain. The rein slipped from her lap and fell to the floor with a soft thud. She stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. "They think," she began, her voice a choked whisper. "They think I'm helping them." "They don't think," Graham corrected, his voice hard. "They're using you, or the idea of you." Nora's mind was racing. The pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was holding suddenly clicking into place. The whispers in town, the brand ghosts' escalating aggression, and now this direct, brutal threat. It all revolved around her, around the past she had tried so desperately to bury. Later that evening, long after the cookhouse had gone dark, Nora climbed the ladder to her loft. She didn't light the lantern. She moved by the pale moonlight filtering through the small window, a ghost in her own small refuge. She knelt on the floor and pulled her canvas satchel from beneath the cot. Her hands were shaking as she emptied its meager contents onto the rough wooden planks. The spare shirt, the tin of salve, the wrapped bread, and beneath them all, a small, oilskin pouch. From the pouch, she carefully extracted a folded document. It was brittle with age, tearing at the creases. It wasn't the worthless promissory note. It was something she guarded even more closely. It was half of a survey map, showing the proposed route of the Black Willow Railroad spur. Her husband had been carrying it the night he died. The map was torn raggedly down the middle, a violent bisection, but in the bottom right corner, beneath a clause detailing mineral rights, was a signature. It was faint. The ink faded to a brownish ghost, but it was legible in the moonlight. Hollis, the name of the official railroad mediator. Her husband had always said Hollis was the only honest man in the whole negotiation. He'd claimed this original map, the one with Hollis's signature, proved the agreed-upon route would bypass the valley entirely. Suddenly, Nora understood with a sickening clarity. The rumors, the note, the stolen cattle. It was all a coordinated campaign of pressure. Someone desperately needed the other version of the map, the fraudulent one that routed the tracks through Meadow Hook, to be accepted as truth. And for that to happen, the original document or anyone connected to it had to be discredited or destroyed. They needed her gone. Her very presence at Larkspur, the ranch most affected by the fraudulent route, was a threat. They were using the brand ghosts to squeeze Graham, to make him believe she was the source of his misfortune, to force him to cast her out. If she fled, a disgraced and frightened widow, who would ever believe any claim she made about a torn, half-forgotten map? Her fear, a cold and constant companion for so long, was suddenly eclipsed by a wave of pure, clarifying anger. Graham saw the light from her lantern finally flicker to life an hour later. He walked from the main house to the barn, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't call up to her. He just stood at the bottom of the ladder and waited. She came down a few minutes later, the torn map clutched in her hand. She looked different. The hunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. "My husband was killed for this," she said, her voice low but steady. "He was trying to bring it to the magistrate in Silvergate. He believed this signature would prove the other contract was a forgery." Graham looked from her face to the tattered paper. "Hollis. I remember that name. He disappeared right after the survey dispute. They need me gone, Nora stated, not as a question, but as a fact. So this piece of paper becomes just the ravings of a dead man, presented by his disgraced widow. A grim understanding passed between them. Her personal tragedy and his ranch's crisis were two sides of the same debased coin. Tomorrow, Graham said, his decision absolute. I'm taking you to Silvergate. We'll show this to the county clerk. See if they have the original deed filings. We get this verified. Nora recoiled as if struck. No, I can't go back there. That's where it all happened. The inquest, the whispers, they all started in Silvergate. The fear, so recently banished, flooded back into her eyes. To face that town again was to face the ghosts of her husband, her failed life, her public humiliation. It was a pilgrimage she was not strong enough to make. While this quiet drama played out in the Larkspur barn, a different kind of conspiracy was being hatched in the smoke-filled back room of the Gilded Cage. Mabel Crow poured 2 glasses of her best whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light of the oil lamp. Across the small table sat Quinn Ash, a man who made his living trading in guns, information, and intimidation. He had a lazy smile that never reached his cold, watchful eyes. He's still keeping her on, Mabel said, pushing a glass toward him. Even with the whole town talking, he's either a fool or more stubborn than a mule stuck in mud. Quinn took a slow sip of the whiskey, savoring it. Stubbornness is a Lark family trait. So what's it to you, Mabel? Why's this one little brown mouse get under your skin so bad? She's a problem, Mabel said, her voice sharp. She's a complication Graham doesn't need. A man in his position, with those kids, he needs a respectable wife, not a barn-dwelling stray with a scandalous past. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. He needs a little push in the right direction, a reason to see that the woman is nothing but trouble. And you want me to provide the push? Quinn said, a flicker of interest in his eyes. Nothing serious, Mabel assured him, her smile brilliant and false. Just a scare, rattle her cage, make her want to run, make the ranch feel unsafe. Graham's a proud man, but he's protective. If he thinks her presence is putting his home at risk, he'll send her packing himself. Quinn drained his glass and set it down with a soft click. A good scare can be more effective than a bullet sometimes, and a whole lot more profitable. The night grew deeper, the moon obscured by a thin veil of high clouds. In the main house, Graham put his children to bed, his movements gentle but his mind elsewhere. He told Jed he was going to take a late ride to check the fences along the creek. A plausible excuse. Jed, a man who could read his boss's moods like the weather, simply nodded and said, "I'll ride with you." They didn't head for the creek. They circled wide, 2 dark shadows moving through the sagebrush, and came to a stop on a low ridge overlooking the branding fields. And they waited. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, a flicker of light, a single torch, moving cautiously from the direction of Silver Butte. Then another. The 2 lights converged near the holding pens, the flames casting long, dancing shadows from her loft window. Nora saw it too. She had been unable to sleep, her mind a turmoil of old fears and new resolutions. The distant torchlight was a confirmation of everything she now suspected. They were out there. The men who had threatened her. The men who were systematically destroying Graham's ranch. She moved to her small pile of belongings and retrieved the oilskin pouch. From it, she took not the map, but a small, well-cared-for pocket knife. It had been her husband's. The handle was smooth, worn bone, the single blade honed to a razor's edge. He had been a man of papers and contracts, not weapons, but he had always carried this knife. She opened it. The blade caught the moonlight with a cold, predatory gleam. She held it in her palm, the weight of it solid and real. This time, her hand was perfectly steady. Below, on the ridge. Graham and Jed watched as the men with the torches there, where 3 of them cut a half-dozen calves from a small herd and began to build a fire. "They're getting bold," Jed whispered, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. too bold," Graham whispered back. "This is a performance. They want to be seen." Suddenly, one of the men looked directly toward the main ranch buildings. A mile distant, he lifted a rifle. In the barn. Nora had moved from the window to a wide crack between the wall planks, giving her a clearer, if narrower, view. She saw the man lift the rifle. She saw the orange flash blossom in the darkness. The sound of the shot was a flat, hard crack that echoed across the valley. A heartbeat later, something slammed into the main support post of the barn, not 10 feet from where she stood. The impact was like a physical punch, a deep, resonant thwack that vibrated through the floorboards. Splinters of wood exploded into the air. In the stall below, Thistle screamed a high, terrified sound of pure panic and reared, her hooves crashing against the wooden walls. The other horses erupted into a chorus of panicked whinnies and stamping. Nora didn't hesitate. She scrambled down the ladder, the open knife still clutched in her hand. The barn was chaos, a symphony of animal fear. She ran to Thistle's stall, unlatching the door and slipping inside. The mare's eyes were wide with terror, rolling in their sockets. "Easy, girl, easy now," Nora soothed, her voice a low, calming murmur. She didn't touch the horse at first, just stood, letting the mare sense her presence, her lack of fear. "It was just a noise, just a loud noise in the night. You're safe in here. You're safe." She repeated the words like a mantra, and slowly, the great horse's trembling began to subside. A few minutes later, Graham and Jed rode hard into the ranch yard. They had seen the muzzle flash and had immediately spurred their horses homeward. Graham swung down from the saddle before Titan had fully stopped and strode into the barn. He found Nora standing in Thistle's stall, one hand stroking the mare's neck, the other hand at her side, still holding the small, gleaming knife. His eyes went from the knife to her calm face, to the fresh, splintered gash in the main support beam. He walked back out into the moonlight. A dark stain was spreading across the sleeve of his shirt, high on his forearm. "They had wire strung between the cottonwoods," he said to Jed, his voice tight with a cold, controlled rage. He had ridden right into it in his haste to get back. A warning. He turned and looked back at Nora, who had followed him out. His gaze was intense, all hesitation gone, burned away by the events of the night. The choice had been made for them. "Tomorrow," he said, the words an unbreakable vow. "We go to Silvergate." Nora met his gaze, unflinching. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the anger was stronger. She was tired of running. She was tired of being a pawn. She gave a single, sharp nod. "I'll go," she said, her voice clear and strong in the sudden quiet of the yard. "I'll go, if you let me stand watch with you tonight." Graham's acceptance of her condition was a simple, curt nod. There was no argument, no questioning of her resolve. He saw the grim determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw, and understood that this was not a request, but a necessity. For her to face Silvergate, she first had to stand her ground here. At Larkspur, she needed to prove to herself, as much as to him, that she was no longer a victim of circumstance, but an active participant in her own defense. Jed Cormack, ever the pragmatist, cleaned and rebandaged the gash on Graham's arm with a strip of cloth and a liberal application of foul-smelling antiseptic from the stable's medical kit. "You'll stand watch," Jed said, his words directed at Graham but his gaze including Nora. "But you'll do it from the house porch, where you can see the whole yard. I'll take the west ridge. We can signal with the lanterns if need be. No sense in both of us being out in the open." Graham didn't protest. It was a sound plan. From the elevated porch of the main house, he and Nora would have a commanding view of the barn, the corrals, and the dark, open ground that stretched toward the creek. It was a defensible position, a small island of light in an ocean of encroaching darkness. They settled onto the top step of the porch, a single lantern placed on the railing above them, its yellow light pushing back the shadows in a small, determined circle. Graham took the rifle from Jed, resting it across his knees. Nora sat a respectful distance away, her back straight against a porch column. her husband's small, sharp knife resting on the step beside her. She had wrapped a thick wool shawl around her shoulders, but the night air had a damp, penetrating chill that seemed to seep into her bones. For the first hour, they sat in a silence broken only by the night sounds of the ranch, the sigh of the wind through the eaves, the soft stamp of a horse in the barn, the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. The tension was a living thing between them, a taut wire humming with the unspoken fears and nascent hopes of the last few hours. The bullet hole in the barn post was a dark, accusatory eye in the lantern light. Then, the weather began to turn. The wind, which had been a steady, sighing presence from the west, died down completely. The silence that followed was unnatural, heavy, and expectant. A faint, metallic smell, the scent of ozone and distant rain, began to perfume the air. On the far horizon, a low bank of clouds, invisible just moments before, began to swallow the stars. "Storm's coming," Graham said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't need to look at the sky. He could feel it in the pressure of the air, the sudden stillness of the leaves on the cottonwood tree by the well. The first drops of rain were not a gentle mist. They were fat, heavy, and cold, striking the dusty ground with audible splats, raising little puffs of dust that immediately turned dark. They struck the shingled roof of the porch with a sound like scattered pebbles. Within a minute, the scattered drops became a steady drumming. Then, a roar. A torrential downpour descended upon Larkspur Ranch, a solid, silver sheet of water that blurred the edges of the world, transforming the familiar ranch yard into a churning, mysterious landscape. The wind returned with a vengeance, driving the rain in sideways sheets. It slammed into the front of the house, rattling the window panes. A particularly violent gust caught the porch, and the lantern on the railing swayed wildly, its flame guttering, casting frantic, dancing shadows. The circle of light shrank and threatened to extinguish completely. "Here," Graham said, reaching over. He moved the lantern from the railing to the floorboards between them, where it was more sheltered from the wind. The flame steadied, but the light was lower now, throwing their faces into a stark relief of shadow and gold. The rain was now so heavy that it was bouncing off the yard and spraying up onto the porch, soaking the hems of Nora's dress and shawl. She shivered, a deep, involuntary tremor that shook her entire frame. It was a reaction not just to the cold, but to the accumulated exhaustion and fear of the long, terrible night. Graham saw it. In the flickering lantern light, he saw the goosebumps on her arms, the slight blue tinge of her lips. Without a word, he stood, shrugging out of his heavy canvas ranch coat. It was a formidable garment, lined with wool, smelling of damp earth, leather, and the faint, clean scent of the man himself. He didn't hand it to her. He stepped behind her and gently, carefully, draped the coat over her shoulders. The weight of it was a shock. It was heavy, solid, a tangible shield against the storm. The wool lining was still warm from his body, and the sheer size of the garment enveloped her, the sleeves hanging far past her hands, the collar reaching high behind her head. It was like being wrapped in a protective embrace. The sudden, intimate warmth, combined with the coat's substantial weight, seemed to anchor her, to stop the trembling in its tracks. He sat down again, closer this time. The confines of the sheltered space, the need to stay out of the driving rain, had reduced the world to the few feet of dry porch boards they occupied. He was so close now that she could feel the heat from his body, could hear the soft sound of his breathing over the roar of the storm. If she listened closely, she could almost discern the steady, powerful beat of his heart, a deep, reassuring rhythm beneath the chaotic drumming of the rain. Nora pulled the coat tighter around herself, her fingers sinking into the thick, warm wool of the lining. Her hand, which had been resting on her lap, came up to clutch the front of the coat, to hold it closed against another gust of wind. She had spent the afternoon before mending a split seam on a pine fence rail, and her palm was still tacky with the sticky, fragrant resin. As her hand came to rest on the rough canvas of the coat, just over his chest, she was acutely aware of the faint stickiness, the trace of her day's labor. It was a practical gesture, born of necessity, but it became something more. Her hand was now resting on him, a small point of contact that felt as charged and significant as the lightning that was beginning to flicker silently in the distant clouds. She didn't move her hand. She couldn't. She lifted her head, and her eyes met his. In the low, warm light of the lantern, the world fell away. There was only the roar of the rain, the flickering flame, and the intense, searching look in his eyes. All the questions, all the suspicions, all the pain and fear of the past weeks seemed to dissolve in that single, prolonged gaze. He wasn't looking at the veiled widow. He wasn't looking at a potential conspirator or a source of trouble. He was looking at her, and she, in turn, saw past the hard, stoic rancher, the burdened landowner. She saw the weary father who had paced the halls with his sick child. She saw the man who had seen the truth in a simple bruise. She saw a loneliness in his eyes that mirrored her own. The unspoken words hung in the air between them, more powerful than any declaration. Words of gratitude, of fear, of a shared and profound weariness. Words of a dawning, terrifying, and beautiful recognition. It was Graham who broke the silence. His voice, when he spoke, was so low she had to strain to hear it over the storm. It was a voice stripped of all its hard edges, a quiet confession in the heart of the tempest. "You're not a debt," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're not trouble brought to my door." He took a slow, deliberate breath, and she felt the slight rise and fall of his chest beneath her hand. "You're the reason I'm slowing my breath." The words settled over her, as warm and heavy as his coat. It was the most poetic, most profoundly moving thing anyone had ever said to her. He wasn't accusing her or pitying her. He was telling her that her presence, this woman who believed she brought nothing but ruin, had somehow brought a measure of calm to his own turbulent world. It was an admission of a vulnerability that matched her own. He leaned forward, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, to turn her head, to break the spell. She didn't move. She stayed perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath caught in her throat. His kiss was as gentle and hesitant as a prayer. It was a soft, chaste press of his lips against hers, brief and incredibly tender. There was no passion in it, no demand, only a deep and abiding respect. It was a kiss that offered comfort, not possession. It was warm and dry and tasted faintly of the rain-scented air. It was enough to feel the connection, the spark of something new and fragile. But it left a respectful space between them, a breath of air that acknowledged the gravity of the moment and the dangers that still surrounded them. When he drew back, it was only by an inch. Nora, feeling a sudden, dizzying wave of emotion, let out a shaky breath and leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. His skin was cool from the rain, and she could feel the steady thrum of his pulse at his temple. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, a genuine, tremulous smile touched her lips. It was a fragile, watery thing, but it was real. In this small, storm-racked shelter, surrounded by danger, she felt a flicker of something she had long thought dead hope, a sound, sharp and out of place, cut through the roar of the rain. It was the unmistakable clatter of a shod horse losing its footing on wet rock, coming from somewhere far down the creek bed. It was followed by a low, muffled curse carried on the wind. The spell was broken. Instantly, they both stiffened, pulling back, the reality of their situation crashing back in on them. Graham's hand went to the rifle on his lap, his gaze sweeping the rain-swept darkness beyond the porch light. Nora's hand, which had remained on his chest, fell away. "Jed," Graham said, a statement more than a question. It had to be. No one else would be out in this weather. They separated slowly, the intimacy of the moment replaced by the cold, hard pragmatism of survival. The promise of the dawn journey to Silvergate, and all the danger it entailed, was once again at the forefront of their minds. Nora adjusted the heavy coat on her shoulders, the warmth of it now a poignant reminder of the moment that had just passed. She stood, preparing to retreat to the relative dryness of the doorway. "I should," she began, not knowing how to finish the sentence. As she turned, Graham's voice stopped her. It was a low, earnest whisper, almost lost in the sound of the rain. He was repeating the promise he had made to her in the darkness 2 nights before, but now the words carried a completely different weight. They were no longer just an offer of help. They were a plea. "If you have to go," he said. "If Silvergate proves too much and you decide to just keep riding, let me go with you." Her breath caught in her chest. She looked back at him, at his serious, weather-beaten face illuminated by the lantern, and she knew he meant it. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the magnitude of his offer. Then she turned and slipped inside the dark, quiet house to wait out the rest of the night. Later, curled on a sofa just inside the front room, Nora couldn't sleep. She had taken off Graham's coat, folding it carefully and placing it beside her, but the scent of it, rain, wool, and a faint, masculine trace of him lingered in the air. She reached out in the darkness and pulled it over herself like a blanket. She buried her face in the collar, inhaling the scent that was now inextricably linked with a moment of unexpected tenderness. A new, fragile hope was wrapped around her heart, as warm and heavy as the coat itself. Outside, the relentless rain continued to fall. It turned the dusty ranch yard into a sea of mud, sluicing through the gullies and arroyos. It washed over the branding fields, cleansing the earth, and in its indiscriminate deluge, it erased a set of fresh, unfamiliar boot prints that had been left near the fence line of the Meadow Hook pasture, washing away all evidence of a clandestine visitor in the night. The world was remade in mud and shadow. The deluge that had broken the tension of the night had also transformed the land, turning the hard-packed earth of the ranch yard into a sucking quagmire. The pre-dawn air was cold, scoured clean by the storm, and so heavy with moisture it felt like breathing water. They moved as 3 shadows, unified by a single purpose. Graham Lark rode in the lead, his bay, Titan, picking its way through the muck with a sure-footed confidence. His rifle was in its scabbard, but a revolver was holstered in easy reach on his hip. Nora rode Thistle, the mare's nervous energy channeled into a focused, jittery awareness. She felt the outline of the torn map tucked deep beneath her woolen shirt, a secret warmth against her skin, a piece of paper that had become impossibly heavy. Jed Cormack brought up the rear, his head on a constant, slow swivel, his gaze sweeping the dark, rolling hills behind them. He was a silent guardian, a man whose presence was as solid and dependable as the mountains. Their progress was slow. The sound of their horses' hooves was a thick, pulling schloop as they navigated the saturated lowlands, avoiding the gullies that had become churning, muddy rivers in the night. They spoke not at all. The only sounds were the creak of wet leather, the jingle of harness, and the labored breathing of the horses. Nora's world, which only hours before had been a small, storm-lashed porch, had expanded to include the vast, hostile darkness, and the 2 men who moved through it with her. They reached the high ground as the first tentative hint of light bruised the eastern sky, a faint, sickly gray that offered illumination but no warmth. They were heading for Sage Loop Pass, the most direct and most treacherous route to Silvergate. The pass was a narrow cut through a spine of weathered granite, a choke point that saved half a day's ride but left travelers exposed. "We go through fast," Graham said, breaking the long silence. He didn't look back, but his voice carried clearly in the still air. "Keep your heads down. Don't stop for anything. Jed, you're 50 yards back. If anything happens, you don't stop for us. You ride on. You get to Silvergate." "And what?" Jed's voice was a low growl. "Tell the sheriff you 2 are—" "Tell him nothing," Graham cut in, his voice hard as iron. "You get her to Silvergate. You get that map to the courthouse. That's the only thing that matters. Understood." Jed's reply was a curt, reluctant, "Understood." Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He was making a contingency plan. He was nominating Jed as the survivor, the one to complete the mission if he and Nora fell. The thought made the map against her skin feel like a block of ice. They entered the pass. The granite walls rose steeply on either side, slick with rain and moss. The trail was barely wide enough for 2 riders abreast, littered with loose rock washed down by the storm. The air grew thin and cold, and the sound of their horses' hooves echoed strangely. Nora's gaze was fixed on a formation ahead Dog's Ear Rock, a twin pinnacle of granite that loomed against the graying sky like the sentinels of a forgotten, malevolent god. Graham felt it first, a subtle shift in the air, the sense of a gaze upon him. He slowed tight into a walk, his hand dropping to the revolver on his hip. "Graham," Nora whispered, sensing his tension. Before he could answer, a flat, dry crack that was not an echo split the morning. A chip of granite exploded from the rock face inches from Graham's head, stinging his cheek with stone fragments. A second shot followed almost instantly, kicking up dirt by Thistle's hooves. The mare reared, screaming in terror. "Quinn Ash!" Graham bellowed, his voice a raw command. "Show yourself!" A mocking laugh drifted down from the rocks above. "Morning, Lark. You're up early, but you brought something that don't belong to you." Nora saw him then. Quinn Ash was perched on a ledge about 60 feet up, his rifle resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. He had a lazy smile on his face, as if this were a Sunday hunt. Another man, one Nora didn't recognize, was 30 yards farther down the pass, blocking their exit. Graham's reaction was not thought, but pure, protective instinct. He spurred Titan, forcing the big horse sideways, intentionally slamming into Thistle. The impact nearly unseated Nora, but it served its purpose. His body became a wall between her and the man on the ledge. "Ride! Nora, ride!" he yelled, drawing his revolver and firing 2 quick, covering shots toward the ledge. But the second man, the one blocking their path, raised his own rifle. They were caught in a crossfire. From behind them, there was no gunshot. There was only a whistling, singing sound. The sound of a rope slicing through the damp air. Jed Cormac, sitting calmly on his horse at the mouth of the pass, had uncoiled his lariat. The loop flew with practiced, deadly accuracy. It snapped open just as the second man was taking aim, dropping neatly over his head and shoulders. The man had time only for a strangled grunt of surprise before Jed reined his horse back hard. The rope snapped taut, and the man was ripped from his saddle as if by an invisible hand. He hit the rocky trail with a sickening crunch and lay still. Quinn Ash's lazy smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of fury. He chambered another round, aiming not at Graham, but directly at Nora. "Go!" Graham roared, slamming his open palm onto Thistle's rump. The mare bolted, charging down the pass, Nora clinging desperately to the saddle horn. Graham was right behind her, firing his last 2 shots at the ledge, forcing Quinn to duck. They burst out of the pass and onto a wide, open plateau, the horses' hooves pounding the ground, their breaths coming in huge, ragged gasps. Nora looked back. Quinn Ash and his one remaining companion. Now on foot, but running for his horse, were emerging from the pass behind them. They were exposed. "They're faster than we are." "Graham," Nora shouted over the wind, "Thistle is tiring. We can't outrun them." Graham scanned the terrain. His face was a mask of grim calculation. He knew this land. To the left, head for the silt run, go. Nora didn't question him. She pulled Thistle's head, following him as he veered off the main trail and toward a wide, alkali white scar on the land. It was the silt run, a treacherous dry creek bed that was a harmless ditch in summer, but a quagmire of thick, clinging mud after a heavy rain. "They'll follow our tracks," Nora cried, realizing the flaw. "They'll see us turn. They'll see what I want them to see," Graham yelled. He reined in, his horse skidding to a stop. Jed pulled up beside them, his face grim, his lariat already coiled. "Get down," Graham ordered Nora. "Both of you, get into those rocks." He pointed to a small jumble of boulders 50 yards from the mud flat. "Don't make a sound." "What are you doing?" Nora asked, her voice tight with panic. "Changing the narrative," he said. He dismounted, handing her Titan's reins. "Keep them quiet." He ran back to the main trail, his boots sinking deep into the mud. He grabbed a large, broken sagebrush branch. Then, starting from where they had turned, he began to walk, dragging the heavy branch behind him, obliterating their tracks. He worked his way backward, smoothing the earth, making it look as though no one had ever left the main trail. He was halfway done when Quinn and his man appeared. Riding hard, they didn't slow down. "He's trapped," Nora whispered, horrified, from the rocks. "Wait," Jed breathed, his hand on his rifle. Graham saw them coming. He tossed the branch aside and ran, not for the rocks where Nora and Jed were hidden, but in the opposite direction, sprinting across the open ground directly toward the silt run. He made a show of it, stumbling once, looking back over his shoulder as if in a blind panic. "He's drawing them," Jed muttered, a note of awe in his voice. "Clever bastard." Quinn Ash let out a whoop of triumph. He and his man spurred their horses, charging after the lone, fleeing figure. They were so focused on their prey that they didn't see the dark, wet sheen of the mud flat until it was too late. They hit the silt run at a full gallop. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The horses' hooves sank instantly, as if plunging into wet cement. The lead horse, the one Quinn's man was riding, went down. Its front legs swallowed to the chest. It let out a high-pitched scream of terror and pain, flipping over on its side, trapping the rider's leg beneath it. Quinn, a better horseman, managed to pull his mount back, but it was already mired to its hocks. The horse fought, churning the thick, gray mud, only succeeding in sinking itself deeper. Quinn cursed, a string of vile, furious oaths that echoed across the flat. He was stuck. Graham, who had stopped just short of the mud, turned and walked calmly back toward the rocks, reloading his revolver as he went. "We have to help them," Nora said, her face pale. The sound of the trapped, screaming horse was horrifying. "No, ma'am," Jed said, his voice cold. "We don't. That mud will hold them for hours. By the time they get free, we'll be in Silvergate." Graham reached the rocks and took Titan's reins from Nora. He didn't look back at the men he had trapped. His face was hard, set. "Let's ride. We've lost too much time." They reached Silvergate just before noon, weary, mud-splattered, and raw with adrenaline. The town was a shock to Nora's system. After the open, clean emptiness of the high desert, the closeness of the buildings, the smell of coal smoke, damp wood, and the river felt suffocating. She felt the familiar, suffocating tightness in her chest. This was the town that had judged her, the town that had whispered her name with pity and scorn. They rode straight to the train station, a small, bustling depot noisy with the clatter of the telegraph. But the platform was strangely empty. The station master, a harried man with a green eye shade, didn't look up from his ledger. "Help you? When's the next train east?" Graham asked. "Ain't one," the man said, still writing. "Not till morning, maybe. Bridge at 2 Mile Creek is washed out. Track's underwater. Engineering crew is stuck on the other side. Nothing's moving." Nora and Graham exchanged a look. The 1-hour delay from the outline had become an indefinite one. They were stranded. "The courthouse," Graham said, his voice low. "Let's finish this." The county courthouse was a 2-story brick building that tried to look important and mostly succeeded in looking tired. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper, floor wax, and the faint, acidic tang of spilled ink. They were directed to the county clerk's office, a small room lined with towering shelves of massive, leather-bound ledgers. Behind a high counter sat a woman of indeterminate age, with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a sharp nose and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her eyes wider. She was Miss Beatrice Loom, and her gaze missed nothing. "We're here to see the county clerk," Graham said, removing his hat. "I am the county clerk," she replied, her voice as crisp as a fresh banknote. "State your business." Graham gestured to Nora. "This is Mrs. Nora Vale. We have reason to believe a fraudulent land survey was filed concerning the Black Willow Railroad spur." Miss Loom's gaze shifted to Nora. It was not unkind, but it was intensely dissecting. "The veil matter. Yes, I remember the inquest. A sad business." She looked at Nora's hands, then back to her face. "You have a claim." Nora, her voice trembling slightly, reached into her shirt and pulled out the oilskin pouch. She unwrapped the torn, fragile map. "My husband, Thomas, he was trying to bring this to Silvergate when he died. He said this was the true survey. He said this signature was the only one that mattered." She pushed the map across the counter. Miss Loom adjusted her spectacles and leaned forward. She stared at the faint, brownish signature for a long, silent minute. "Silas Hollis," she breathed, her sharp demeanor softening for an instant. "My goodness, I haven't seen his signature in 2 years. He was a good man, meticulous, honest. He was the railroad's chief mediator." She looked up at Nora. "He disappeared right after that survey dispute went public. They said he ran off with company money." "He didn't," Nora whispered. "No," Miss Loom agreed, her eyes hard again. "He wouldn't have." She turned, energized, and disappeared into the towering shelves of the archive. They could hear the heavy thud of a ledger being pulled, the rustle of large, stiff pages. She returned a few minutes later, carrying a massive, dusty book. She opened it on the counter, her finger running down a column. "Here it is, the Black Willow Spur Survey, filed and recorded, binding." She turned the book for them to see. It was a pristine, complete map, and it showed the railroad line cutting directly through Graham's Meadow Hook pasture. This is the forgery," Nora said, her heart sinking. "This is what Thomas was fighting." "This Mrs. Vale is the official record," Miss Loom said flatly. "But," she paused, tapping the page, "your husband was right. Look at the filing stamp." She pointed to a purple ink stamp in the margin. "It was filed on October 14th, 3 days after Silas Hollis was reported missing to the U.S. Marshals." A cold silence filled the room. "Who filed it?" Graham asked, his voice a low growl. Miss Loom ran her finger down to the bottom of the ledger page. "Application submitted by a local merchant, a Mr. Ephraim Dale." Graham and Jed looked at each other, a dark, sudden understanding passing between them. "Ephraim Dale," Jed said, his voice quiet but clear. "He runs the freight depot. He's the one who supplies Mabel Crow with all her whiskey and necessities from St. Louis." The connection was no longer an insinuation. It was a solid, iron link. Nora felt suddenly dizzy. "So, it's over. His map is the official one. My piece of paper, it's useless." "Useless," Miss Loom gave a sharp, dry laugh. "Mrs. Vale, your piece of paper is evidence. It's the original, bearing the signature of the only man authorized to approve it, a man who conveniently vanished just before a fraudulent copy was filed by a third party." She closed the ledger with a decisive thud that echoed in the small room. "I am scheduling an emergency injunction hearing with Judge Reeves," she declared, looking at Nora over the rim of her spectacles. 3 o'clock, tomorrow afternoon. Be here. And Mrs. Vale." "Yes, ma'am. Do not, under any circumstances, lose that map." They walked out of the courthouse and onto the wide, damp boardwalk. The adrenaline that had kept Nora going for the past day evaporated, leaving her hollow and cold. The damp air of the town, thick with coal smoke and the metallic smell of the river, clung to her. She wrapped her arms around herself and shivered, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that was as much shock as cold. Graham, walking beside her, saw it. He stopped. He didn't offer his coat, which was soaked through and muddy. He didn't say a word. He simply reached over and took her hand. It was not the urgent, desperate grip on her wrist in the pre-dawn barn. It was a quiet, firm possession. His fingers lacing with hers, his palm was calloused and impossibly warm, a furnace against her icy skin. He was anchoring her, transferring his own strength and heat to her. It was a gesture of profound, public alliance. He was no longer just her protector. He was her partner. Jed Cormack stepped off the boardwalk and scanned the street, his gaze moving over the rooftops, the alleyways, the dark windows of the saloon across the way. "Well," he said, his voice low and grim, "we can't go back to the hotel. We can't go back the way we came. Quinn's not the kind of man to forget being made a fool of in a mudflat. He's got friends in this town. They'll be watching the road." Graham's gaze moved to the train station at the end of the street. "The station master said the train is stuck till morning. The depot is federal property, and it'll be lit all night." He gave Nora's hand a gentle squeeze. "We'll stay there. We'll be safe there." The three of them walked toward the station, a small, weary island in a town that was, in its own way, as hostile as the open range. They settled onto the hard, polished wooden benches of the waiting room, the air smelling of stale tobacco and wet wool. They would take turns, one on watch, two trying to rest. The immediate fight for survival was over. The war had just been declared. The cramped silence of the station's waiting room was a poor defense against the world outside. They sat in a triangle of exhaustion, Jed upright on the bench, his hat tipped low, appearing to doze but with his rifle resting against his leg. Graham, standing by the grimy window, watching the empty, rain-soaked street, his mind clearly miles away, calculating, planning, and Nora. Her hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles ached, the precious map a stiff, rectangular weight against her ribs. They had existed in this suspended state for hours, the rotation of their brief, fitful attempts at sleep broken by the steady click-clack of the telegraph key from the station master's office. It was the only sound, a metallic, coded heartbeat in the otherwise dead town. Nora was the first to notice it. It was a smell, insidious and wrong. It crept in beneath the familiar sense of wet wool, stale tobacco, and coal smoke. This was sharper, greener, the smell of burning grass, of dry pine, of a world on fire. She stood abruptly. "Graham." He was already turning from the window, his head tilted, his nostrils flared. He had smelled it too. Jed. Jed was awake instantly, his hand on his rifle, his eyes sweeping the room. "What is it?" "Smoke," Graham said, his voice flat. He moved to the station door, pushed it open a crack, and inhaled deeply. The acrid sting was immediate, unmistakable. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, Nora and Jed close behind him. The rain had stopped, but the wind had not. It was a dry, agitated wind, blowing hard from the southeast, and it was carrying not just the smell of smoke, but a visible, gritty haze. Over the rooftops in that direction, the low, heavy clouds were lit from beneath with a sick, flickering, orange-red glow. From the end of the street, a man's voice, thin with panic, yelled, "Fire, fire on the flats!" Then, as if summoned by the cry, the town's alarm bell began to ring. A frantic, discordant clang, clang, clang that shattered the night. "Ephraim Dale," Graham said, his voice a low, cold growl. "His old, fallow hayfield is southeast of town." It was not an accident. Nora knew it with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. A fire, set on the edge of town, was the perfect, terrifying distraction. It was a chaotic public threat that would draw every able-bodied man away from their duty, away from the courthouse, away from protecting a lone widow and her two guardians. "We have to go," Graham said, already moving. "If that fire catches the wind right..." He didn't need to finish. The wind was gusting, pushing the fire not just into town, but toward a specific, vital target. The bell ringer was shouting it now, his voice cracking with terror. "It's jumping the road. It's heading for the granary, the public granary, the town's food supply for the rest of the winter." People boiled out of houses and the saloon, their faces pale and shocked in the hellish, dancing light. The scene was one of pure, disorganized panic. Men ran in circles, some with buckets, some with shovels, yelling at each other with no clear plan. The fire was moving with terrifying speed, a roaring, crimson wave that consumed the dry, post-storm grass, its front 100 yards wide, embers, like a cloud of angry, incandescent insects were already lifting on the wind, sailing over the first row of buildings. Graham took command instantly, his voice a bellow that cut through the hysteria. "Jed, get the freight wagon from the livery. Get the water barrels. Soak every blanket and horsehide you can find. We'll meet it at the granary wall." Jed was gone, a solid shadow sprinting toward the livery stable. Graham grabbed a discarded axe from the ground. "Nora, stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone." "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. He turned, shocked by her defiance. Her face was grim, her eyes wide, but not with panic, with a cold, clear focus. "You need every hand. I can't fight, but I can organize." He stared at her for one long second, saw the steel in her spine, and gave a single, curt nod. "The horse troughs. Get a bucket line started, now!" Nora ran to the long wooden troughs in front of the saloon, which were overflowing from the recent rain. A small group of women and older children stood huddled by the mercantile, watching the approaching flames with terrified, useless awe. "You—" Nora's voice was sharp, cutting. It was not the voice of the quiet widow. It was the voice of a woman who had seen the world end and had learned to survive. "We need water. Form a line from this trough to the side of the courthouse." "The granary!" a woman shrieked. "It's going for the granary. It will burn both," Nora shouted, pointing. "The wind is shifting, look." She was right. The wind, swirling around the buildings, was pushing a second front of the fire, a smaller, grasping tendril of flame, directly toward the dry, wooden wall of the brick courthouse, the very building that held Miss Loom's ledgers. The granary was food, but the courthouse was the law. It was their only hope. "We can't save the fields," Nora yelled, yanking a bucket from a frozen-looking boy's hand and plunging it into the trough. "We save the buildings." She thrust the heavy, sloshing bucket at the boy. "You, stand here. Phil, you," she said to a teenage girl. "Stand 10 feet from him. You, to a woman. 10 feet from her. A line past the water. Don't run with it. Pass it." Her certainty broke their paralysis. In moments, a human chain had formed, moving with a desperate, rhythmic efficiency. Nora turned to the small group of younger children, boys and girls from 8 to 12, who were watching, pale and frightened. This, she knew, was a delicate, dangerous moment. "You," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its authority. "We need you. You are our lookouts." She ran to the trough, soaked several discarded rags and aprons in the water, and ran back, handing one to each child. "Hold this over your mouth and nose. Stay low to the ground. The air is better here, away from the main heat. Your job is to watch for sparks." She pointed to the wooden boardwalks, the rooftops of the small sheds, the dry grass patches behind the line of men. "Embers are flying. If you see one land, you stomp it. Yell for help if it's too big, but stomp it fast. Do not let the fire get behind us. Can you do that?" They nodded, their small faces serious, their fear replaced by a sense of profound, immediate purpose. They were not being asked to fight the inferno. They were being given a vital, manageable task. They were defenders, not victims. They fanned out, their wet cloths held high, their eyes scanning the ground. Meanwhile, Graham was a force of nature. He had commandeered Titan, his own bay, and was riding back and forth along the fire's edge near the granary, a heavy, soaked horsehide attached to a rope, dragging it, beating and smothering the flames in a cloud of choking, acrid smoke. Jed and 3 other men were on foot beside him, using wet blankets to beat at the most stubborn sections. Graham's face was a mask of soot, his eyes red raw and streaming from the stinging smoke, but he did not stop. He was a general in a war against a faceless, roaring enemy. Nora ran back and forth, her dress soaked, her hands raw, encouraging the bucket line, directing water to where it was needed most. The heat was a physical blow, a blast furnace that scorched her skin and dried her throat. She could hear the fire now, a deafening, constant roar, like 1,000 freight trains, punctuated by the sharp crackle of burning wood and the crash of a nearby shed collapsing. It was in this infernal light that she saw Mabel Crow. Mabel wasn't fighting. She was standing in the mouth of the alley beside her saloon, which was, for the moment, upwind and safe. She was bathed in the red light, her arms crossed, her face a mask of horrified fascination. She was watching the town fight for its life. Then her gaze found Nora. She watched as Nora, hair wild and face streaked with ash, bodily shoved a panicking man back into the bucket line, her voice raw. "We are not losing that wall back to it, and get back to it?" Mabel's gaze shifted from Nora to the building Nora was so desperately trying to save, the courthouse, the records office, the place that held the proof of Ephraim Dale's, and by extension, her conspiracy. She was watching a woman she had tried to ruin, a woman she had slandered and set Quinn Ash against, risk her life to save the very building that held the evidence against them all. The complexity of it, the irony, the sheer, selfless decency of the act seemed to break something in Mabel. Her look of fascination curdled into one of raw, conflicted shock. Her face, usually a mask of confident control, wavered. An hour later, the fire was contained. It was not out, but the main front had been beaten back. The granary was scorched but standing. The courthouse wall was a blackened, steaming, blistered mess. But it had held. The town was saved, for the most part. The adrenaline fled, leaving behind a collective, bone-deep exhaustion. People sank to the ground, coughing in the thick, smoky air, their faces black, their hands burned. Nora, her lungs aching, leaned against the horse trough, the world spinning slightly. "You!" The voice was low, urgent. Mabel Crow was at her elbow. Before Nora could react, Mabel's hand, surprisingly strong, clamped around her arm. "Come with me, now!" Mabel didn't wait for an answer. She pulled Nora off the street, out of the dying light of the fire, and into the deep, suffocating darkness of the alley beside the saloon. The air in here was cool, sheltered, and smelled of stale beer and refuse. Mabel shoved her against the brick wall and released her. "You're a fool, you know that." Mabel's voice was a harsh, ragged whisper. She wasn't angry. She was rattled. "What are you talking about?" Nora coughed, her throat raw. "That building," Mabel hissed, jabbing a finger back toward the street. "The courthouse. You were saving that, don't you know what's in there?" "I know," Nora said simply, meeting her gaze in the dark. Mabel stared at her, her breathing heavy. The last of her composure seemed to crumble. This was not a game she understood. I just wanted to scare you," she finally admitted, the words tumbling out. "I told Quinn to put a fright into you, make you run. I didn't know he was tied up with those brand ghosts. I swear I didn't. I didn't know they would do this, not this." The confession hung in the dark, damp air. Mabel hadn't ordered the arson, but her actions had lit the fuse. She was terrified. This was no longer a petty, provincial rivalry. This was a serious crime, and she was in the middle of it. "Why are you telling me this?" Nora asked, her voice flat. "Because this has gone too far," Mabel snapped. "Quinn, Ephraim, they're not just trying to scare you. They're trying to erase you. And they're fools. They're meeting tonight. Ephraim is supposed to be paying the men who set the fire." Nora's blood went cold. "Where?" "The old Saltfinch warehouse, at the river landing," Mabel said, the words coming fast now. She was cutting her losses, saving herself. "An hour. He's paying them with silver. You take that rancher of yours, and you go stop him. You stop him, and you leave my name out of what happens in that courthouse tomorrow. Do you understand me?" Nora said nothing. She just stared at the woman who had, in her own selfish, terrified way, just handed them the weapon they needed. Nora didn't run. She walked, with deliberate, measured steps, back to the train station. The air was thick with the smell of wet, vanquished ash. Jed was there, cleaning his rifle. "Where's Graham?" "Dousing the last of the embers at the granary. He'll be back." Nora relayed Mabel's information in a low, steady monotone. Jed's face hardened. He was loading fresh cartridges into the rifle before she had even finished. The Saltfinch. I know it. It's isolated. A perfect place for a quiet transaction. Graham returned 10 minutes later. He was moving slowly, favoring his arm, his face a mask of soot and pure exhaustion. He slumped onto the bench, his red-rimmed eyes closing. "Graham," Nora said gently. He opened his eyes. She told him. The exhaustion vanished, evaporated as if it had never been. He didn't say a word. He stood up, picked up his revolver from the bench, checked its load, and slid it back into his holster. A new, cold, and utterly implacable energy had taken over. "I'm going," he said. "We're going," Jed corrected, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "No," Graham said. "One of us has to stay with her. The map, the hearing, that's all that matters. You go in there alone against 2, maybe 3 men, and there won't be a hearing," Jed countered, his voice as hard as his boss's. "Ephraim's a coward, but those ghosts ain't. You need a witness, Graham, and you need a man at your back." They stared at each other for a long, silent moment. Graham finally gave a single, sharp nod. He turned to Nora. "Bar this door. Load Jed's spare revolver. Keep it on your lap. Do not, for any reason, open this door until you hear my voice." "Understood." Nora nodded, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "Be careful." He and Jed slipped out into the smoky darkness, 2 ghosts moving toward the river. The Saltfinch warehouse was a sagging, dilapidated structure perched at the end of a rotting pier. The river, swollen from the rain, gurgled and hissed against the pilings. The only light came from a single, bobbing lantern hanging from a hook on the warehouse wall, casting long, grotesque shadows. Graham and Jed moved through the shadows of the riverbank, silent as the fog rising from the water. They found a position behind a stack of rotting barrels, giving them a clear view of the pier. They didn't have to wait long. 3 men emerged from the warehouse. One was Ephraim Dale, his merchant's clothes looking absurdly out of place. He was visibly trembling, his eyes darting everywhere. The other 2 were rough men, with the hard, sun-scorched faces of the brand ghosts Nora had seen in the pass. But neither was Quinn Ash. These were his employees. "You got it," one of the men growled. Ephraim fumbled with a heavy canvas bag, the unmistakable clink of silver ringing in the night air. "It's all here, as agreed, for the distraction." "It was more than a distraction," the second man said, snatching the bag. "That was hot work." "Yes, well, it's done," Ephraim said, wringing his hands. "Now, our agreement is concluded. You leave, you don't come back, and my name is never spoken. We'll be the judge of that," the first man said with a cruel chuckle. It was then that Graham stepped out from behind the barrels. He didn't run. He walked, his boots thudding with deliberate, measured steps on the wooden pier. He stopped 20 feet from them, the lantern light catching the cold fury in his eyes. "Ephraim," he said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, rough sound, like stones grinding together. "You're a long way from home." Ephraim Dale let out a high-pitched, strangled squeak of terror. The 2 ruffians dropped the silver and went for their guns. They were too slow. Graham's revolver was already in his hand, aimed not at them, but at the bag of silver at their feet. "Touch those guns and your pay sinks to the bottom of the river," Graham said, his voice lethally calm. "Now, back away from it, slowly." The 2 men hesitated, their hands hovering over their holsters. They were killers, perhaps, but they were also mercenaries. The sight of their payment being held hostage gave them pause. "Ephraim," Graham continued, his gaze never leaving the 2 men. "You're going to come with me to the sheriff's office. You're going to sign a new, truthful statement about who hired you to file that fraudulent map." I can't," Ephraim stammered, backing away. "He'll ruin me. I'll give you one chance," Graham said. "Sign the paper, or I'll take that silver and you can explain to your friends here why their pay is gone. And then I'll take you." It was a perfect trap. Ephraim was caught between his fear of Graham and his terror of the men he'd just paid. He chose the most cowardly option. With a desperate cry, he grabbed the bag of silver, not to keep it, but to hurl it. "Take it!" he shrieked, throwing the heavy bag at Graham's head. Graham ducked, the bag sailing past his ear and landing with a heavy thud on the pier. In that same instant, Ephraim turned and ran, scrambling back toward the dark safety of the town. The two brand ghosts saw their opening. As Graham was off balance, they both drew. A single, flat crack echoed over the water. It didn't come from Graham. It came from the darkness by the barrels. A splinter of wood exploded from the pier post. A half-inch from the first man's head, Jed Cormack stepped into the light, his rifle shouldered, his aim steady. "Drop them," he said, his voice bored. The two men, staring at the smoking hole in the wood, wisely let their revolvers fall to the pier. Ephraim, in his blind panic, didn't see the thick mooring rope coiled on the dock. He hit it at a full run and went down, sprawling hard on the wet planks. He lay there, sobbing, a pathetic, broken figure. "Get up, Ephraim," Graham said, walking over to him, his gun now holstered. "Please," Ephraim cried, grabbing at Graham's boots. "You don't understand. I had no choice. He made me. I only followed the order. It wasn't Mabel. She just made the introduction. It was never her." Graham and Jed froze. "Who? Ephraim?" Graham asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Who made you, Ephraim?" Realizing what he'd said, snapped his mouth shut. He bit his lip so hard a trickle of blood ran down his chin. He stared up at them, his eyes wide with a new, more profound terror, a terror of the man he had just implicated. He shook his head, clamping his lips shut, refusing to say another word. The courtroom in Silvergate was not a place of grand justice. It was a box built of pine, and on this hot, smoky afternoon, it was suffocating. The air was a thick, oppressive soup of human sweat, stale ink, and the sharp, resinous smell of the wooden walls themselves, which seemed to be sweating in the heat. Every bench was packed. Ranchers who had heard of the fire and the subsequent hearing had ridden in, their faces grim, standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. It was a room primed for a verdict, a community holding its breath. At the front, Judge Reeves, a man with a face like worn leather and eyes that had seen every trick in the book, struck his gavel once. The sound was a sharp, final crack that cut through the low murmur of the crowd. "This court is convened for an emergency injunction hearing," he announced, his voice a dry rasp. "In the matter of the Black Willow Railroad Spur Survey, contested by Mrs. Nora Vale and Mr. Graham Lark, Miss Loom. You may proceed." Beatrice Loom, the county clerk, rose from her seat. She was a pillar of starched, gray efficiency in the sweltering room. She did not look at the crowd. She addressed the judge as if they were the only two people present. "Your Honor," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "The county archives contain this, the officially filed survey for the Black Willow Spur." She placed the large, bound ledger on the judge's bench, open to the page. It was filed, as the stamp indicates, by Mr. Ephraim Dale on October 14th of last year. She then turned and with a small, almost theatrical gesture, took the oilskin pouch from Nora. She carefully unwrapped the torn, fragile piece of map. "We also have this, a document fragment provided by Mrs. Vale, which she attests is the original draft survey." She laid the fragment on the bench. "I am not a handwriting expert, Your Honor, but I am the keeper of the county's records, and in Ledger 4A, page 88 is the last known signature of the mediator, Mr. Silas Hollis, on an unrelated water rights filing." She produced a third document. "I ask that you compare the signatures." Judge Reeves leaned forward, his spectacles perched on his nose. He looked at the signature on Nora's map. He looked at the signature in the archive. He looked back at Nora's map. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a man coughing in the back row. "The hand is the same," the judge said. It was not a question. It was a finding of fact. "Miss Loom, you also brought a timeline to my attention." "Yes, Your Honor," Beatrice said, her voice sharp as a new nail. "The fraudulent map, the one filed by Mr. Dale, Was submitted to my office on October 14th. I have here a telegraph record from the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver, time-stamped October 11th, 3 days prior, declaring Mr. Silas Hollis as officially missing. A low, angry murmur swept through the room. A man disappeared, and 3 days later, his work was forged and filed. The court calls Mr. Ephraim Dale, Judge Reeves said, his gaze sweeping the room. Ephraim Dale was a ruin of a man. He had been held in the town's single-cell jail overnight, and he looked as if he hadn't slept in a year. His merchant's suit was rumpled. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He stumbled as he made his way to the stand, his hands visibly trembling. "Mr. Dale," the judge began, his voice deceptively mild. "You filed the survey map in that ledger, is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ephraim whispered, his eyes fixed on the floor. "And you knew it to be a true and accurate copy of Mr. Hollis's original work?" Ephraim's face crumpled. He was a small man, a coward caught in a trap far too large for him. He looked for a lifeline, his eyes darting wildly. He saw Graham Lark, his face a mask of cold granite. He saw Jed Cormack, his arms crossed, his expression one of pure, undisguised contempt. "Mr. Dale, answer the question." The judge pressed. I was paid." "Your Honor," Ephraim burst out, the confession exploding from him. "It was just a job, I'm a freight agent. People pay me to file manifests, deeds, surveys. It was just another piece of paper. Who paid you, Mr. Dale?" Here, Ephraim froze. The terror that had gripped him on the pier returned, 1,000-fold. This was the one question he could not answer. I can't say." "This is my courtroom, sir, you will say," Judge Reeves commanded, his voice no longer mild. "A benefactor. An anonymous party," Ephraim stammered, grabbing the line he had clearly rehearsed. He had interests in the railroad. He paid me in silver to file the new route. That's all I know, I swear it." "You swear it," the judge repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. He was about to press further when a voice came from the crowd. "He's telling the truth. About that, at least." Every head in the courtroom turned. Mabel Crow was standing, her hands clasped in front of her, her face pale but resolute. She had dressed with care, not in her usual satin, but in a modest, dark blue traveling suit. She looked like a woman preparing for a journey. "Miss Crow," the judge said, his surprise evident. "This is highly irregular. You are not under oath." "Then swear me in, Your Honor," Mabel said, walking to the stand with a confidence that Ephraim had utterly lacked. She took the oath, her voice steady. "Mr. Dale is a coward," she began, not looking at Ephraim. "But he is not, entirely, a liar. He was paid by an outside party. I know this, because I was the one who made the introduction." The room gasped. Graham went rigid. "I introduced Mr. Dale to a business associate of Mr. Quinn Ash," Mabel continued, her words precise. "I was told it was a simple land speculation, that a new survey was being filed and Mr. Dale's discretion was required. I was paid a fee for this introduction. That is the beginning and the end of my involvement in the survey." She then turned, her gaze sweeping over the ranchers at the back. "But I will say this to every man in this room. I had no knowledge of the brand ghosts. I had no knowledge of a fire. I did not hire men to attack Mr. Lark's ranch, nor to burn this town. That is a line I have never, and would never, cross. My business is in this town. I would not see it destroyed." It was a masterful performance. She had admitted to a small, greedy, and unethical act, brokering a secret deal while vehemently and publicly divorcing herself from the violent, criminal consequences. She had painted herself as another victim of Quinn Ash's deception. "Thank you for your candor, Miss Crow," the judge said, his expression unreadable. "You may step down." He looked at Nora, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Vale, do you have anything to add?" Nora stood. She walked to the stand, her steps measured and calm. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a survivor. She took the oath. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the hot, still room. "I am not a lawyer, and I don't understand land speculation, but I understand this." She held up her half of the map. "This is why my husband, Thomas, is dead." The courtroom, which had been buzzing with Mabel's testimony, fell dead silent. "The night he died," Nora continued, her voice clear, her emotions held in a vice of iron control. "He was supposed to be on a passenger train to Silvergate to bring this map to the magistrate, but he was afraid. He knew he was being followed, so he hid. He hid on a freight car, in an empty grain hopper. He thought they wouldn't find him there." She paused, and her throat worked. "The car was shunted onto a siding. There was an accident. A coupling broke. The car, it rolled. When they found him, this map was inside his shirt, crumpled in his hand. He died alone, in the dark, on a freight car, trying to keep this piece of paper safe. He died because he believed this map was the only thing that could stop a group of powerful men from stealing land. From stealing this land." She pointed out the window, toward Meadow Hook. She said it all without a single tear, and the lack of histrionics made it all the more devastating. It was not a plea for pity. It was a cold, hard statement of fact. The cost of the fraudulent map in the ledger was one human life. "Thank you, Mrs. Vale," the judge said, his voice thick. "Is there any further evidence to be presented?" "Your Honor." Jed Cormack stepped forward. He held a small, dark object in his hand. "My name is Jed Cormack, foreman of the Larkspur. I'm not a man of paper, but I am a man of cattle." He stepped up to the bench and laid the piece of dried, branded hide on the wood. "We were attacked at Sage Loop Pass 2 days ago by Quinn Ash and his men. This piece of hide was in one of their saddlebags. It's a brand, a Larkspur L, blotted and faked." He then pointed to a thin, surgical-looking cut on the hide. "And this is what links it all. This is a dry cut. It's a professional's trick, to make the new brand take deeper. The calves being stolen from Mr. Lark's ranch. They have the same cut. The men who set fire to this town last night, they were paid by Ephraim Dale, who was working for Quinn Ash. It wasn't a land dispute. Your Honor, it was a conspiracy. Steal the land on paper, and steal the cattle on the ground. Burn the town to cover the tracks." The puzzle was complete. Every piece was on the table. Judge Reeves leaned back in his chair. He looked at the torn map. He looked at the branded hide. He looked at Nora's calm, pale face. He did not deliberate for long. He picked up his gavel. "This court finds as follows," he declared, his voice booming in the small room. 1. The signature of Silas Hollis on the document fragment provided by Mrs. Vale is authentic. 2. The survey map filed by Mr. Ephraim Dale on October 14th is hereby declared null, void, and a fraudulent instrument. 3. The original survey, as indicated by the Hollis draft, is the only one recognized by this county. The Black Willow Spur will not cross Meadowhook pasture. He struck the gavel. Crack. Furthermore, he roared, cutting off the rising cheer, I am issuing a bench warrant for the arrest of Mr. Quinn Ash on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, cattle rustling, and arson. The room exploded. Men were shouting, slapping each other on the back, shaking Jed's hand. It was a sudden, violent release of pressure. In the chaos, Nora saw Beatrice loom. The county clerk was not cheering. She was simply and methodically packing her ledgers. She looked up, caught Nora's eye, and gave a single, sharp nod. A dry, triumphant smile touching her lips for just an instant. Nora felt a wave of dizziness, and her hand went to the rail to steady herself. It was over. It was truly over. Jed was clapping Graham on the shoulder, a huge, rare grin splitting his face. Graham's own expression was one of profound, stunned relief. He looked across the room at Nora, and his eyes were so intense, so full of a raw, unbridled emotion, that she had to look away. They were pushed by the crowd. out of the hot, suffocating room and onto the wide courthouse steps. The air outside had changed. The smoky, acrid pall of the fire had been scrubbed clean. A new wind was blowing, sharp and cool, carrying the unmistakable, clean, electric scent of new rain. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, ready to open. Nora stood on the top step, breathing in the clean air, her entire body trembling with the release of a tension she had carried for years. "Nora." Graham's voice was thick. She turned to him. He hadn't moved from her side. He was looking at her not as a rancher, not as a boss, but as a man who had just been pulled from a wreckage. His logic, his careful control, his stoic defenses were all gone, burned away by the fire and the trial. Before she could speak, his hands were on her, one on her arm, the other on her waist, pulling her to him. It was not a gentle invitation. It was a desperate, claiming act, an embrace that was less about affection and more about a profound, elemental need. He buried his face in her hair, his arms a steel cage around her, holding her so tightly it almost hurt. She was stiff, shocked by the sudden, public display. "Stay," he whispered, the word a raw, broken plea against her temple. "Don't go, please, stay." The words ran through her, more powerful than the judge's verdict, more final than the gavel's crack. This was his ruling. This was his truth, running ahead of his reason. She stood frozen in his arms for a long second, the sounds of the celebrating town fading to a distant roar. Then, slowly, tentatively, her body, which had been rigid with shock, softened. Her hands, which had been pressed awkwardly against his chest, crept up, her fingers grasping the rough canvas of his shirt. She didn't say yes, she didn't have to. She simply stayed. She did not pull away. "Mr. Lark." Mabel Crow's voice cut through the moment. Graham's head came up, his arms loosening but not releasing Nora. He kept one arm possessively around her waist, anchoring her to his side. Mabel stood a few steps below them, her traveling bag in her hand. She looked, Nora thought, relieved. She had taken her gamble and won. She looked directly at Nora, and the practiced, brittle artifice was gone from her face. Her eyes were clear, and for the first time, honest. "Mrs. Vale, Nora," she said, the name a small admission. "I am sorry. For my part in this, I was jealous, and I was cruel. I never intended any of this." She gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. "You're a better woman than I am." She then nodded to Graham, a final, respectful acknowledgement. "Mr. Lark." Without another word, she turned and walked down the steps, her back straight, moving through the crowd and toward the stagecoach office, a woman who had saved herself from the wreckage she had helped create. A single, cold drop of rain struck Nora's cheek. She looked up. The bruised sky was finally letting go. Graham watched Mabel walk away. Then his gaze returned to Nora's face. The raw emotion was still there, but it was softer now, tinged with a deep, quiet wonder. He let go of her waist, but only to find her hand. He didn't just take it. He laced his fingers through hers, a firm, deliberate, and public binding. Nora looked down at their joined hands. This time, she didn't just let it happen. She closed her own fingers, holding him back. A promise given, and a promise returned, all without a single word. As the heavens opened and the clean, new rain began to fall. They stood together on the courthouse steps, not as a rancher and a widow, but as two survivors, finally, safely, on the same side. The return journey from Silvergate was a world removed from the tense, desperate flight that had preceded it. They rode under a vast, rain-washed sky, the air so clean it felt like a new creation. The silt run, which had been their salvation, was now just a wide, drying mud flat, the abandoned horse and its trapped rider long gone. Jet had found their tracks. Quinn Ash and his man had spent the better part of the day freeing themselves before limping back toward the lawless territory to the north. They were gone, for now. News, even in the vast emptiness of the high desert, travels with a strange and rapid velocity. By the time they were halfway home, they were met by a rider from a neighboring ranch, a man who tipped his hat and offered Graham a wide, honest grin. "Heard you put a stop to the Black Willow nonsense. Lark, the whole valley owes you one." By the time they crested the last ridge and saw the familiar buildings of Larkspur nestled in the draw below, they were no longer just a rancher and his hired hand. They were heroes. The homecoming was not a grand affair, but it was profound. The other hands, who had once viewed Nora with a mixture of suspicion and pity, now met her gaze with open respect. They had heard the story of the fire, of her testimony, of her unwavering courage. In the unforgiving meritocracy of the West, she had earned her place. The atmosphere on the ranch shifted. The oppressive weight of fear and suspicion was lifted, replaced by a buoyant, almost giddy sense of relief. The brand ghosts, with their leader Quinn Ash, now a wanted man with a warrant on his head, seemed to have vanished into the ether. For the first time in months, the men rode the fence lines without looking over their shoulders. But Graham knew better. A man like Quinn Ash did not simply disappear. He was a snake who had been scotched, not killed. He was out there, somewhere in the Badlands, nursing his wounded pride and his fury. This was a reprieve, not a permanent peace. This knowledge spurred him into action. The day after their return, Graham stood in the blacksmith's forge, the air hot and ringing with the sound of the hammer. He held one of the old Larkspur branding irons, the simple, blocky L that had marked his family's cattle for 2 generations. It felt solid, dependable, but it also felt incomplete. It represented the past, a past that had been vulnerable, a legacy that had almost been stolen. Nora found him there, drawn by the rhythmic clang of steel. She stood in the doorway, watching as he turned the iron over in his hands, his brow furrowed in thought. "What is it?" she asked softly. "This brand," he said, not looking up. "It's too simple, too easy to blot, to alter. I need something more, something that can't be so easily erased." Nora was silent for a moment. She picked up a piece of charcoal from the smith's bucket and, on a clean, smooth piece of scrap pine, she began to sketch. She didn't draw a complex new design. She drew something simple, something she saw every spring along the banks of the Juniper Creek, a single, delicate sprig of larkspur, the flower that gave the ranch its name. 2 leaves, a slender stem, and the unmistakable shape of the spurred blossom. When she was done, she held the board out to him. He took it, his gaze dropping to the simple, elegant drawing. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. The sprig was a perfect complement to the blocky L. It was intricate enough to be difficult to forge, but simple enough to be a clean, clear brand. It was a mark of life, of beauty, of the wildness of the land itself. It was a mark of renewal. It was a mark of her. "I'll ride to Silvergate in the morning," he said, his voice thick. "I'll have the new brand registered with the territorial office, Larkspur, Vale." He looked at her, and the name hung in the hot, ringing air of the forge, a question and a statement all at once. Nora felt a blush creep up her neck, but she did not look away. She simply nodded. The renewal was not just on paper. It became a physical act, a reclamation of the land. The entire ranch was mobilized. A crew was dispatched to the Willowshade Ravine to replace the fence posts that had been cut and repair the wire that had been strung as a trap. Graham insisted on new boundary markers. Solid cedar posts painted a brilliant white, a clear, defiant statement of ownership. Nora found a role for the children in this new order. Ivy and Abel, who had for so long been confined to the house and its garden, were brought into the fold. Their task was simple, safe, and filled them with a sense of profound importance. Nora showed them how to use a stencil and a small pot of black paint to label the new barrels of hay and oats that had been delivered. Soon, the feed room was a monument to their cheerful, slightly wobbly handiwork, oats, hay, barley. They worked with a focused joy, their laughter echoing in the barn, a sound that had been absent for far too long. They were no longer just observers of ranch life. They were a part of it. Their small contributions a vital thread in the newly rewoven fabric of their home. One evening, as the sun set, painting the alkali flats in shades of rose and gold, Nora stood with Graham on the porch, watching the last of the fences being mended. The ranch felt whole again, the wounds of the past few weeks beginning to scar over. "The men have worked hard," she said quietly. "Everyone has. They deserve something. A celebration." Graham looked at her. "What did you have in mind?" "In the town I grew up in," she said, her gaze distant. "After the harvest, we'd clear out the biggest barn. We'd have a dance, for the new grass, for the good work." A barn dance. The idea was so simple, so wholesome. It felt revolutionary. It had been years since there had been a proper celebration at Larkspur. Not since before his wife's passing. "We'd need music," he said, the idea taking root. "I might know where to find some," Nora said, a small, tentative smile on her face. The next day, Jed Cormack rode into Dry Lantern Ridge with a message. He did not go to the hotel or the mercantile. He tied his horse outside the gilded cage and walked in. The saloon was quiet in the midday lull. Mabel Crow was behind the bar, polishing glasses. She looked up when Jed entered, her expression wary. "Cormack," she said, her voice cool. "Miss Crow," he replied, removing his hat. He stood at the bar, solid and unmoving. "There's to be a barn dance at Larkspur, Saturday night, to celebrate the new grass." He paused. "Mrs. Vale thought the occasion might call for a fiddle." Mabel stopped polishing. She stared at him, her mind clearly working. It was not an invitation to the dance. It was something else, an offering, a chance, an opportunity to publicly demonstrate her contrition, to buy her way back into the good graces of the community she had helped endanger. Nora had not extended a hand in forgiveness, but she had, with extraordinary grace, built a bridge. Mabel placed the glass and the cloth on the bar. "You tell Mrs. Vale," she said, her voice formal, "that I know a trio of the finest fiddle and banjo players this side of the Rockies. They will be at Larkspur on Saturday, and their fee will be my contribution." Saturday night descended like a blessing. The cavernous main barn, swept clean and smelling of fresh hay and beeswax from the polished lanterns, was transformed. Dozens of lanterns hung from the rafters, swaying gently in the evening breeze, casting a warm, golden, honey-colored light over everything. They looked like a constellation of low-hanging stars. The community had turned out in force, ranchers and their families from miles around, their faces scrubbed clean, their clothes their Sunday best. The fiddle trio Mabel had sent was, as promised, exceptional. The music was a lively, joyful thing, a river of reels and jigs that set boots to stomping on the hard-packed earth of the barn floor. The air was filled with laughter, the swirl of calico dresses, and the scent of the apple cider Nora had made for the children. Ivy and Abel, their faces flushed with excitement, were in the center of it all, dancing with the other children, their small, clumsy steps, a perfect expression of the evening's joyful, uninhibited spirit. Nora stood near the open barn doors, watching. She wore her best dress, a simple cotton print of blue flowers that she had mended and pressed with care. Her hair was up, and for the first time, a genuine, untroubled smile lit her face. She felt a sense of belonging so profound it ached. She saw Mabel near the cider barrels, speaking quietly with another rancher's wife. Mabel caught her eye and gave a small, respectful nod. Nora returned it. The bridge had been crossed. Then she felt a presence at her side. "They say it was your idea," Graham said. He was not wearing his dusty work clothes. He was in a clean, dark shirt and trousers, his hair still damp from a recent washing. He looked younger, the lines of worry and exhaustion erased from his face. "It felt necessary," Nora said, not looking at him, her gaze still on the dancers. "It was," he agreed. The fiddle music softened, the wild reel melting into the slow, sweet, melodic strains of a waltz. The floor cleared as the older, more graceful couples took their places. Graham turned to her. He didn't speak. He simply held out his hand. Nora's heart gave a sudden, powerful leap. Her hand, which had mended fences and groomed horses and stood strong in a fire, felt suddenly shy and small. She placed it in his. His hand was warm and strong, his calloused palm a familiar, comforting weight against hers. He led her to the center of the floor. He placed his other hand on the small of her back, on the simple cotton of her dress. It was a proper, respectful placement, his touch firm but gentle, maintaining a decorous distance between them. But even with that small space, she could feel the heat of his palm, a warmth that seemed to spread through her entire body. They began to dance. The world shrank to the circle of golden lantern light they occupied. The music, the laughter, the stomping feet, it all faded to a distant, pleasant hum. There was only the slow, 3/4 time of the waltz, the gentle guidance of his hand on her back, and the intense, unwavering focus of his gaze. They moved together with a grace that surprised them both. Two solitary people who had forgotten how not to be alone, suddenly finding a shared and perfect rhythm. When the last, long, sweet note of the fiddle faded into the rafters, they stood for a moment, motionless in the center of the floor as the other dancers applauded. The kiss they had shared on the stormy porch had been born of desperation and a dawning tenderness. This was different. This was a culmination. He leaned down, and his kiss was longer this time. It was still gentle, still profoundly respectful, but it was not hesitant. It was a deliberate, searching kiss, filled with all the questions asked and answered, all the trials they had endured, all the unspoken promises of the past few days. It was a kiss that tasted of hope, a kiss that was on fire with the beautiful, patient flame of waiting. When they finally broke apart, the applause had died down, and the band was striking up a new, livelier tune. "Well, now, boss." Jed Cormac's voice, dry and amused, came from nearby. He was leaning against a support post, a mug of cider in his hand. "Don't you go staying up too late. Them new calves won't wait for sleepy man come morning." A hot blush spread across Nora's cheeks, a delightful, unfamiliar sensation. Graham just smiled, a slow, easy grin that transformed his face. He didn't release her hand. From across the barn, Mabel Crow watched them. She saw the blush on Nora's face, the genuine, unguarded happiness on Graham's. A strange, unfamiliar feeling settled over her. It was not jealousy. It was not regret. It was a sense of peace. A sense that, despite her own flawed and selfish actions, something good and right had nonetheless managed to bloom in the dust of Juniper Draw. She turned and quietly slipped out of the barn, her part in their story, finally, truly, over. Much later, when the last of the guests had departed and the lanterns were being extinguished one by one, Graham walked Nora to the base of the ladder leading to her loft. The barn was quiet now, the air cool and smelling of hay and the memory of music. He still held her hand. He looked at her in the light of the single remaining lantern, his expression serious. He was a man who measured his words, who did not speak of feelings easily. "Nora," he began, his voice a low, earnest rumble. He gently touched her wrist, the very place he had first grabbed her in the darkness. "That first morning, I stopped you from leaving." He paused, his thumb stroking the delicate skin of her inner wrist. "If the sunrise comes tomorrow and tries to pull you away again, I will hold your wrist. I will stop you." He met her gaze, his own intense and unwavering. "But only if you want me to." It was the question he had been asking her, in 100 unspoken ways, since the moment he had first seen the kindness in her eyes. It was the question of her past, and the question of their future. Nora looked down at his hand holding her wrist, then back up at his face. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, luminous certainty. She leaned forward, and her reply was a soft, breathy whisper, a secret shared in the quiet heart of the barn. "Maybe," she said, a tremulous smile touching her lips. "Maybe I want to be held." The peace of Larkspur Ranch shattered in the hour before dawn. It was not a loud, violent breaking, but a silent, insidious one. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the cottonwoods by the creek, moving with a predator's economy. Quinn Ash did not look like a man who had been humbled in a mudflat. He looked like a wraith, his face a pale, tight mask of cold fury in the gloom. His hand, holding a freshly honed knife, reached up to the thick rope that ran to the cast-iron alarm bell on the cookhouse roof. The rope was a symbol of the ranch's security, its first line of defense. With 2 swift, sawing motions, the rope parted, the severed end falling to the dirt with a soft, dead thud. The second act of vandalism was louder, with a series of sharp, cutting slaps from a coiled rope. He and 2 other riders, men with the hard, desperate look of those who have nothing left to lose, stormed the main corral. They threw open the gates, their wild yells and the crack of their ropes sending the herd of nearly 50 horses, the ranch's entire remuda, exploding out into the darkness. It was not theft. It was chaos. A stampede aimed at breaking the ranch's spirit, scattering its most vital asset to the 4 winds. They were gone in a thunder of hooves and a cloud of dust, leaving behind the swinging, silent gates and the dead, severed alarm rope. It was Nora who found the first sign of trouble. She had risen early, as was her habit, a deep, restful peace in her heart, for the first time in years. The quiet promise exchanged with Graham at the foot of her ladder had been a balm to her soul. She walked from the barn toward the well, and her foot registered something wrong in the damp earth. It was a hoofprint, but it was filled with a thick, reddish-black mud, a soil completely alien to the gray, alkaline dirt of the Juniper Draw. It was the mud of the northern Badlands, a place where a man like Quinn Ash might go to ground. Her eyes followed the tracks. They didn't lead toward the corrals, but away from them, toward the high, windswept plateau to the north known as Raven Shelf. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced the morning's peace. She ran to the corral. The open gates and the empty space within told the story. The ranch came alive with a grim, furious purpose. Jed Cormack, his face a thundercloud, found the cut alarm rope. Graham, his expression hardening into a mask of cold resolve, examined the strange mud. "He's not trying to steal them," Graham said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He's trying to scatter them, send them over the shelf. He wants us to spend a week, maybe more, gathering them up. He wants to cripple us. And while we're chasing horses," Jed added grimly, "he'll be free to do whatever he wants. Strike again, disappear. We'll split up." Graham decided instantly. "Jed, you take 3 men and ride the low country. I'll take 2 and push up toward the shelf. He'll have driven them into one of the box canyons up there." He looked at the vast, rugged terrain, and a flicker of doubt crossed his face. It was an impossible task. "No," Nora said. Both men turned to look at her. She was standing by Thistle's stall, her face pale, but her eyes clear and steady. "Splitting up is what he wants," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "He'll pick you off one by one. You said it yourself. Graham, he's trying to cripple you, not fight you, so we don't fight him his way." She walked over to the tack wall and took down a small object from a hook. It was a heavy, coiled iron whistle, shaped like a ram's horn, used in the old days for signaling across the vast distances of the range. "The herd knows my voice. They know Thistle. They're scattered and spooked, but they're not lost. They're just a family without a leader." Graham stared at her, then at the whistle. He understood her plan instantly. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It put her directly in the path of a desperate, violent man. "Absolutely not," he said. "Nora, you're not—" "I am the only one who can do this," she interrupted, her voice ringing with an authority he had never heard before. "You and Jed can ride the flanks, a half-mile out on either side, a show of force, but let me ride the center. Let me go up the main trail to Raven Shelf. He'll see me. He'll think I'm alone, a foolish woman. He'll come for me. He won't be watching for you." It was a trap. a trap in which she was the willing bait. The thought of it sent a spear of ice through Graham's heart. But he looked into her eyes and saw not fear, but a cold, calculated strategy. He saw the same quiet strength that had faced down a courtroom, that had calmed his crying child, that had held his hand in the rain. He was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts told him that she was right. "Jed," he said, his voice tight, "give her your spare revolver." "I won't need it," Nora said, holding up the iron whistle. "This is my weapon." She rode Thistle up the winding, rocky trail that led to Raven's Shelf. The mare, sensing the gravity of the situation, was calm, her steps sure and steady. Nora rode with her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead. She did not look for Graham or Jed, though she could feel their presence. Two unseen guardians in the vast, empty landscape. The iron whistle was tucked into her belt. She found the herd, or what was left of it, in a narrow, rock-strewn canyon just below the shelf. They were bunched together, their heads low, their coats matted with sweat and dirt. They were spooked and leaderless. She was dismounting, her hand reaching for the whistle, when his voice echoed from the rocks above. Well, the little widow, come to collect her strays." Quinn Ash stepped from behind a massive boulder, his rifle held loosely, aimed at her center mass. His face was gaunt, his eyes burning with a feverish, hateful light. This was not the confident ambusher from the pass. This was a cornered animal. "I knew you'd be the one," he sneered. "Lark doesn't have the stomach for this kind of work. He'd send a woman to do what he can't." Nora's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of calm. She did not reach for a weapon. She did not scream. She slowly, deliberately, let the reins fall from her hand. She took a step away from Thistle, placing herself in the open. Then she began to speak, and the voice she used was not meant for him. It was the low, crooning, monotonous voice she used to soothe the terrified horse. "Easy now," she said, her gaze not on Quinn, but on the nervous herd. "Easy, girl. It's just a loud noise, just a man with a loud voice. Nothing to fear. You're safe now. Shh. Calm now. Calm." Quinn frowned, his rifle wavering slightly. The sound was wrong. It was unnerving. It was the sound of a woman who was not afraid of him. It was the sound of a woman who was completely in control, not of him, but of the entire situation. It was a dismissal. "I'm talking to you," he snarled, taking a step forward. "And I can hear you," Nora said, her voice never changing its soft, rhythmic cadence. "It's all right. Just a bit of thunder. We've heard thunder before, haven't we? It passes. It always passes." She was inside his head. She was using her strange, calm magic to unman him, to reduce his violent threats to the impotent bluster of a summer storm. His anger, the fuel of his hatred, was being smothered by her inexplicable calm. He raised the rifle, needing to break the spell, needing to reassert his power. "Last chance, widow. You turn around and you ride out of this valley and never come back, or I swear to you, or you'll what? Quinn." The new voice, hard as granite, came from the rim of the canyon to Quinn's left. Graham Lark stepped out from behind a stand of juniper trees, his own rifle held at a relaxed ready. He was not alone. Jed Cormack was 20 yards to his right, a silent, lethal bookend. Quinn spun, his rifle swinging toward Graham. His trap sprung, but Graham wasn't looking at Quinn's rifle. He was holding a piece of paper. "This is a signed confession, Quinn," Graham said, his voice echoing in the canyon. "From Ephraim Dale. It details every transaction, every piece of silver, every order you gave. It names you as the leader of the brand ghosts. It names you as the man who hired the arsonists. It's over." Quinn's face contorted in a mask of pure, feral rage. He was trapped. The law, in the form of a piece of paper, had finally caught up with him. With a guttural scream of pure frustration, he swung the rifle back toward the easiest target, toward Nora. He fired. The shot was wild, born of rage, not aim. The bullet screamed off the rock face behind Nora, the ricochet a high, angry whine. In that single, violent moment, Nora reacted. She did not scream or duck. She scooped a handful of the loose, sandy dirt from the canyon floor and threw it, with all her strength, directly into Quinn's face. He roared in pain and surprise, his hands flying to his eyes, the rifle momentarily forgotten. It was the only opening Graham needed. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, covering the ground between them in a blur. He did not strike Quinn. He did not engage in a brawl. His hand shot out and slapped the rifle. Not the man, sending it clattering onto the rocks. His other hand seized Quinn's wrist in a grip of iron, twisting it until Quinn cried out and fell to his knees. Jed was there a second later, a freshly waxed rope in his hands. The entire confrontation, from the shot to the capture, had taken less than 3 seconds. It was a masterpiece of precise, economical, and bloodless action. They bound Quinn's hands and feet, his furious, dirt-caked face a mask of impotent hatred. Jed retrieved the rifle. "The sheriff in Silvergate will be very happy to see you, Mr. Ash," Graham said, his voice devoid of all emotion. They left him there, securely tied. For the 2 men Graham had left at the canyon mouth to collect and transport to justice. Graham turned to Nora. She was standing perfectly still, her hands clasped at her waist, her face as pale as bone. The herd, spooked by the gunshot, had begun to mill nervously. He walked toward her, his heart in his throat. "Nora, are you—" He never finished the sentence. As he reached her, her strength, the iron will that had held her together through the fire, the trial, and this final, terrifying confrontation, finally gave way. It was not a feint. Her knees simply buckled, as if the strings holding her upright had been cut. She crumpled to the ground, not in weakness, but in the shuddering, violent release of a tension that had been her constant companion for years. She curled into a ball, her whole body shaking with deep, silent, racking sobs. Graham was on his knees beside her in an instant. He didn't speak. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her against his chest, holding her tight. He rocked her gently, his hand stroking her hair, sheltering her as the storm of pent-up fear and grief finally broke. He held her until the shaking subsided, until her breathing, which had been coming in ragged, painful gasps, finally evened out. She finally stirred, her voice a muffled whisper against his shirt. "I've run," she said, the words thick with unshed tears. "My whole life, from my family, from my husband's debts, from his memory. I've run from every place I've ever been." He held her tighter. "It's time to stay," he said, his voice a low, unbreakable vow. "This is where the running stops." He helped her to her feet. She was unsteady, but she was whole. She looked at the nervous, scattered herd. The reason this had all happened. She pulled the iron whistle from her belt. She raised it to her lips, took a deep, steadying breath, and blew. The sound that emerged was not a shrill blast, but a long, clear, resonant note, a call that spoke of safety, of home. It echoed through the canyon, a pure, unwavering signal in the morning air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a single horse, a gray mare at the edge of the herd, lifted its head, its ears pricked forward. Another horse, then another. They turned, as one, toward the sound, toward the small woman standing beside the tall, protective man, and the larkspur herd, of its own free will, began to walk, then trot, back down the canyon trail, following the call home. Behind them, on the canyon rim, Jed and the other ranch hands, who had been watching, silent and ready, let out a spontaneous, ragged cheer that echoed off the rocks. As the last of the horses filed past them, the sun finally broke free of the high peaks of the eastern range. A wave of brilliant, golden light washed over the canyon, shattering on the wet rocks, setting the world ablaze with color. It caught in Nora's tear-filled eyes, transforming them into jewels. Graham looked at her, at this incredible, impossible woman, bathed in the light of the new day, and in that moment, he knew, with a certainty that shook him to the core, what he had to do. He knelt, not on 2 knees, but on one, in the dusty earth of the canyon floor. He had no ring, He had no prepared speech. He had only the raw, powerful, unvarnished truth of his heart. He took her hand, the one that had thrown the dirt, the one that had held the whistle, and held it in both of his. "Nora Vale," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "You have saved this ranch. You have saved my children. You have saved me." He looked up at her, his eyes shining. "Make a home here, with me, with us, together." The dawn that followed was not a reprieve. It was a verdict. It was the quiet, profound silence after a long and brutal war, when the last echo of the last gunshot has faded and the survivors are left to take stock of the wreckage and the dawn. In the loft of barn number 3, Nora Vale woke to this silence. For the first time, she had not slept on her simple cot, but in a real bed in the main house's spare room, a room that smelled of lavender and sun-dried linen. But the habit of a lifetime, the instinct of a hunted animal, is not a garment to be shed so easily. Before the first hint of light had touched the sky, she was moving, not with the frantic, desperate haste of her first attempt to flee, but with a slow, ghostly, and unconscious ritual. Her body remembered what her heart was trying to forget. Her hands, acting of their own accord, went to the small canvas satchel. They folded her spare shirt, the one she had washed and mended herself, into a neat square. They wrapped the small, worn photograph in its oilskin pouch. The movements were fluid, practiced, the muscle memory of a woman who had always been prepared to vanish. She was not packing to leave. She was simply packing. It was what she did. It was who she had been. She moved through the still, dark house, a silent ghost in a place that was not yet her own. She passed the room where Ivy and Abel slept, their soft, even breathing a sound of such profound peace it made her heart ache. She slipped out the back door, her worn boots making no sound on the cool flagstones. The air was cold and clean, thick with the scent of damp earth and the promise of a new day. She walked to the barn, her natural habitat, the place that had been her only true sanctuary. The great doors were open a crack, and she slipped inside, the familiar, comforting smells of horse and hay and leather wrapping around her like an old, familiar shawl. She walked to the main entrance, the very spot where this story had truly begun, and she stopped. She was not going to leave. She knew that. In the deepest part of her soul, she knew that the running was over, but some part of her, the part that had been forged in hardship and loss, needed to stand at the precipice one last time. She needed to look out into the darkness and consciously, deliberately, choose not to step into it. A hand closed around her wrist. It was not a grip of possession or restraint. It was a touch so light, so gentle, it was barely there at all. It was a question, not a command. A warm, living presence against her skin. She turned. Graham stood behind her, his form a dark silhouette against the slightly less dark opening of the barn. He had not been sleeping either. His gaze was not on her face, but on the small, pitifully light satchel in her other hand. He looked at it not with anger or betrayal, but with a deep, sad, and profound understanding. He lifted his gaze to meet hers. His eyes, in the gloom, were soft. "Don't leave before the sun comes up, Nora," he said, and his voice was the quietest, gentlest thing she had ever heard. He was not ordering her. He was asking, "Stay. Not because of a debt, not because you owe this ranch anything. Stay because you want to." He was releasing her. He was cutting the last, invisible cord that tied her to the past. He was telling her that she was not a stray he had rescued, not an employee he had defended, not a burden he had chosen to shoulder. He was telling her that she was free. Free to go, and, for the first time in her life, truly free to stay. Her gaze lifted, over his shoulder, past the dark outline of the corrals, to the vast, sleeping expanse of the Larkspur Valley. The land was no longer a hostile, alien place. It was a landscape she knew, a geography she had helped to defend. She knew the curve of the Juniper Creek, the shadow of Raven Shelf, the exact spot in the Willow Shade Ravine where the new fence posts stood. gleaming white in the imaginary sun. From the main house, a sound drifted on the still morning air, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the sound of children's laughter. Ivy, then Abel, their voices clear and bright, a sound that promised breakfast and chores and a life that was simple and real and blessedly, beautifully normal. It was the sound of home. The satchel, which had felt so heavy a moment before, now felt impossibly light, a foolish, meaningless burden. She let it slip from her fingers. It fell to the packed earth floor with a soft, final thud. She reached out, not to embrace him, but to touch the front of his coat, the same rough canvas garment he had wrapped around her in the storm. Her fingers, no longer trembling, traced the thick, clumsy stitching where she herself had mended a tear. She touched the place on his sleeve where his blood had stained the fabric, a scar from a wire meant to harm him. She touched the worn spot on his shoulder where he had carried his children. Her touch was a silent recitation, a cataloging of the wounds they had shared and survived. She was tracing the map of their shared history. In her mind, she named the things she would do. She would plant a garden by the kitchen door. With the same wild mint she had used to sweeten the barn, she would help Ivy mend her dolls and teach Abel how to read the brands. She would ride the fence lines with him, not behind him, but beside him. She would fill the silent, lonely rooms of his house with the sound of her own quiet presence. She would stay. He leaned down and kissed her. It was a sunrise kiss. It was as warm as the first rays of light that were, at that very moment, beginning to touch the highest peaks of the mountains. It was decisive, a seal on a silent vow. It was a healthy, wholesome kiss, a kiss between two whole people, a kiss of profound and gentle respect. It held no desperation, no lingering shadows of the past. It was a kiss that tasted of the future, a promise of 1,000 shared sunrises, of a life to be built, together, in the clean, clear light of day. As they broke apart, the world seemed to wake up around them. A rooster crowed from the henhouse, a loud, triumphant announcement of the dawn. From the cookhouse, the rich, warm smell of baking cornbread and brewing coffee began to drift, a scent of life, of sustenance, of community. A figure appeared at the far end of the barn, walking toward them through the growing light. It was Jed Cormack. He was not alone. Walking beside him, carrying a large glass jar filled with a dark, glistening substance, was Mabel Crow. She had not, it seemed, taken the morning stage after all. She stopped a respectful distance away, her face clear and unadorned in the morning light. She looked rested. She looked free. "Mabel," Graham said, his voice quiet, betraying no surprise. "Lark," she replied with a nod. She held out the jar. "Plum preserves, my grandmother's recipe. I thought the children might like some." It was a simple, humble offering, a white flag, a final, definitive end to the war. Graham took the jar. "Thank you, Mabel. I know they will." Jed, a rare, wide grin on his face, held up a piece of official-looking paper. "Came in on the early telegraph from Silvergate," he announced, his voice booming with pride in the quiet barn. "The new territorial brand registration. It's official." He held it for them to see. There, in crisp, black ink, was the familiar, blocky L, and intertwined with it, a delicate, beautiful sprig of a flower, and beneath it, the registered name, Larkspur Vale. Graham looked from the paper to Nora, his eyes shining. He turned to the small crowd that had begun to gather. Jed, Mabel, the cook, the other hands, drawn by the smell of coffee and the sense of a momentous occasion. He put his arm around Nora's shoulders, pulling her tight against his side. "She's staying," he announced, his voice ringing with a deep, happy finality. "Not as a hand, as family." A cheer went up, not a loud, rowdy sound, but a deep, heartfelt rumble of approval. The men slapped their hands on the wooden walls of the stalls, a rough, percussive applause that was more meaningful than any polite clapping. From the corrals, the horses, catching the mood, began to nicker and whinny, a chorus of agreement. Nora looked up at Graham, a smile of such pure, luminous joy on her face that it seemed to light the entire barn. She laid her hand flat on his chest, over his strong, steady, and finally peaceful heart. "This is my home," she said, and her voice was clear and strong and true. High above them, in the rafters of the great barn, a forgotten object hung from a wooden peg. It was the thick wool shawl Nora had worn the night of the dance. A gentle morning breeze, the first of the new day, slipped through the barn doors and stirred it. It swayed gently in the golden, dust-moted light, a banner of surrender, not to defeat, but to peace, a flag for a new and final home. Thank you so much for listening to our story here on Wild West Stories 1850. We truly appreciate you spending your time with us. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and consider hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people. Your support means the world to us.